Some commanders are remembered for speeches, others for spectacle. Frank Jack Fletcher is remembered for decisions made when there was almost no time to make them. When the Pacific War erupted in December of 1941, the United States Navy was not searching for glory. It was searching for stability. Pearl Harbor had torn open the illusion of preparedness. Battleships lay damaged or sunk. The carrier force, fragile, limited, and suddenly central, became the core of American naval survival. Into that fragile moment stepped Fletcher, a career officer shaped not by flamboyance but by calculation. He did not command from myth. He commanded from responsibility. Early in the war, Fletcher found himself at the center of operations that would shape the Pacific conflict's direction. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, notice he led carrier forces in the first naval engagement fought entirely by aircraft, where opposing ships never saw one another directly. The stakes were immediate: prevent Japanese forces from isolating Australia and expanding their defensive perimeter. The result was costly. Ships were damaged. Aircraft were lost. Carriers burned and barely survived. Yet the Japanese advance was checked. For the first time, expansion was denied. Fletcher's decisions were not dramatic flourishes. They were measured risks taken under incomplete information, balancing aggression against preservation. That balance would define his career. At Midway, Fletcher again held senior command over carrier forces during one of the most consequential battles in naval history. Intelligence suggested Japanese movement toward the atoll. Timing, positioning, and restraint became critical. When aircraft launched and converged on Japanese carriers, the battle shifted in minutes. Flames engulfed enemy decks. Momentum in the Pacific pivoted. Yet, even in victory, Fletcher's leadership drew scrutiny. He was cautious with his carriers. He guarded their survival. He withdrew when damage and uncertainty demanded it. To some, this caution felt like hesitation. To others, it was prudence in a war where carriers were irreplaceable assets. Fletcher understood that early in the Pacific War, losing a carrier was not a tactical inconvenience. It was strategic catastrophe. His role at Guadalcanal deepened that tension. As Marines fought ashore, naval forces shielded them under constant threat from Japanese counterattack. Fletcher had to weigh the risk to carriers against the need to support ground operations. Weather, fuel, aircraft losses, and enemy movements all factored into decisions made hour by hour. When he withdrew carrier forces to preserve strength after intense engagements, critics questioned whether the ground troops had been left exposed. But Fletcher's perspective was broader than a single island. He saw a war measured in endurance, not in singular stands. The Pacific was vast. Replacements were not immediate. Air groups required time to rebuild. Command decisions made under pressure had to account not only for present danger, but for future necessity. His career did not carry the flamboyance of some contemporaries. He did not cultivate a larger-than-life persona. Instead, he navigated the early, most precarious months of the Pacific War with an understanding that survival itself was strategic success. Over time, as American industrial capacity surged and carrier numbers multiplied, the balance of caution and aggression shifted across the fleet. Fletcher's star dimmed in comparison to commanders who operated in later, more expansive phases of the war. Yet his early stewardship of fragile carrier strength created the space for that expansion to occur. The history of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher is not the story of a reckless gambler or a timid observer. It is the story of a commander operating at the edge of uncertainty, of decisions made when radar was new, doctrine incomplete, and intelligence partial, of balancing risk and preservation in a theater where loss could not easily be replaced, and of understanding that sometimes victory is not annihilation, but denial. Fletcher's legacy is quiet, but foundational. He helped carry the Navy through its most vulnerable transition, from shock to adaptation, from reaction to initiative. Without preservation in those early battles, there would have been no platform for later dominance. This is the history of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a commander defined not by spectacle, but by judgment, navigating the Pacific War when the margin between disaster and survival was measured in ships and hours. Before you move further into this story, pause for a moment. Notice where you are right now. Is this a quiet part of your day, or something unfolding between other obligations? Has the light shifted since you began listening? Just take a second to register it. Fletcher's decisions were made in moments when certainty was rare. Let this story unfold without rushing past that wait. The seminar room at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, falls quiet on an autumn afternoon in 2015. A professor stands before 30 mid-grade officers, men and women who command destroyers and cruisers, asking a question that should be simple. Name the great American admirals who won the Pacific War. Hands rise immediately. Chester Nimitz, the steady architect of victory. William Halsey, the fighting admiral whose face graced Time magazine covers. Raymond Spruance, the tactician who perfected the carrier task force. The list continues, familiar names repeated in every documentary and textbook, but one name never emerges. The professor waits. Watching faces search memory for something that isn't there, then projects a slide onto the screen that changes the conversation entirely. The slide shows a battle record that should be impossible to forget. 4 major carrier engagements between May and August of 1942, the most critical months of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, a tactical setback that achieved strategic victory by stopping Japan's advance toward Australia, the Battle of Midway in June, the decisive turning point that broke Japanese naval power forever, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August, a tactical victory that sustained America's first offensive operation at Guadalcanal, a 4th engagement at Santa Cruz in October, though by then the admiral in question had already been relieved of command. 3 victories and 1 costly draw, a record unmatched by any other American carrier commander in the war's first desperate year. The professor lets the silence stretch before revealing the name: Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, an officer who commanded more carrier battles than anyone in history, yet remains virtually unknown to the students studying naval warfare in the institution he once attended. The disconnect between achievement and recognition runs deeper than simple historical oversight. Fletcher won the battles that mattered most, the engagements fought when America possessed only 3 or 4 operational carriers against Japan's superior fleet, when losing even 1 flat top could have cost the entire Pacific campaign. He commanded at Coral Sea when the margin between victory and catastrophe measured in minutes and miles, making decisions that traded tactical elegance for strategic necessity. He positioned the American carriers at Midway with such precision that the ambush became textbook perfect, destroying 4 Japanese carriers in a single morning. He sustained the Guadalcanal offensive at Eastern Solomons, despite facing land-based air power and superior Japanese surface forces. Yet his name appears in footnotes while subordinate commanders became legends, their memoirs shaping a narrative that pushed Fletcher into obscurity. The erasure began even before the war ended. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations in Washington, who never forgave caution in any form, wrote assessments that damned Fletcher with faint praise and direct criticism. Fletcher permitted the enemy to escape at Coral Sea, King claimed, ignoring that Fletcher had achieved the strategic objective of stopping the Japanese advance. Fletcher withdrew carriers too quickly from Guadalcanal, King insisted, overlooking that Fletcher correctly assessed the threat from land-based bombers and preserved carriers for future battles. King's judgments, written from the safety of Washington while Fletcher fought in the South Pacific, became official history. Nimitz defended Fletcher repeatedly, noting in private correspondence that Fletcher understood carrier warfare better than his critics, but Nimitz's support couldn't overcome King's institutional power. By the time Fletcher was quietly relieved of carrier command in October 1942 and assigned to administrative backwaters, the narrative had solidified into something approaching myth. The post-war years cemented Fletcher's obscurity through a combination of his silence and others' self-promotion. William Halsey published memoirs that portrayed bold admirals conquering timid superiors, never mentioning Fletcher by name, but making the contrast obvious to any reader. Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, considered definitive for decades, repeated King's assessments without examining actual battle records or questioning the contradiction between Fletcher's results and his reputation. Television documentaries in the 1950s and 60s featured Halsey's aggressive persona while ignoring Fletcher entirely, creating a public memory of the Pacific War that had no room for careful, methodical commanders who won without drama. Fletcher himself never wrote memoirs. Baum never gave interviews beyond brief mandatory statements, never attempted to correct the historical record that increasingly portrayed him as competent but uninspiring. He died in 1973 in his modest Maryland home, having spent 30 years in quiet retirement, while younger officers who served under him became celebrated historians and public figures. The statistical reality that should vindicate Fletcher remains buried in archives and specialist studies. He commanded American carrier forces for 10 months, from late December 1941 through October 1942, a period that encompassed every major carrier battle of the war's first year. During those 10 months, he lost one fleet carrier, the Lexington at Coral Sea, D.C., all while sinking or crippling 6 Japanese carriers and preventing the loss of any carrier in a catastrophic single engagement that would have crippled American naval power. The commanders who replaced him, lauded for aggression and bold action, lost 4 carriers in the 12 months following his relief: Hornet at Santa Cruz, 3 escort carriers in various engagements, and came within moments of losing entire task forces to poor decisions masked by superior resources. Fletcher's fuel calculations, mocked as excessive caution by critics who never commanded at sea, proved accurate when post-war analysis examined actual consumption rates and operational ranges. His insistence on preserving carriers for future battles, derided as timidity, reflected the strategic reality that America couldn't replace losses in 1942 as quickly as Japan could bring forces to bear. Modern scholars who examine Fletcher's record with access to Japanese sources and declassified American documents find a commander whose decisions made sense in context, even when they produced unsatisfying results. At Coral Sea, Fletcher fought blind, operating on fragmentary intelligence while Japanese commanders enjoyed clearer reconnaissance. His decision to launch a full strike at what proved to be minor ships reflected the uncertainty all commanders faced in carrier warfare's infancy, and his positioning prevented a worse outcome when the main Japanese carriers finally appeared. At Midway, Fletcher's methodical search procedures and willingness to wait for confirmation before launching strikes created the conditions for perfect timing, even though subordinate commanders who launched earlier got more public credit. At Eastern Solomons, Fletcher balanced the competing demands of protecting Guadalcanal, preserving carriers, and engaging the Japanese fleet with sophistication that critics in Washington couldn't appreciate from their safe offices. His battle record suggests competence verging on excellence, yet the narrative of caution persists. The human cost of Fletcher's obscurity extends beyond one man's reputation. The Navy learned precisely the wrong lessons from his relief, teaching a generation of officers that boldness mattered more than results. That aggressive action earned promotion, while careful calculation brought career death regardless of actual performance. Commanders who lost ships through reckless decisions faced less criticism than Fletcher received for winning battles while preserving forces. The institutional culture that emerged valued appearance over substance, preferring admirals who looked like warriors to commanders who fought like strategists. Fletcher's silence in the face of injustice, his refusal to defend himself or write the memoirs that might have corrected the record, demonstrated either remarkable dignity or tragic passivity, depending on perspective. He took his story to the grave, leaving only fragmentary letters, official reports stripped of personal voice, and the cold statistics of battles won at acceptable cost. The broader implications reach into how societies remember war and construct military mythology. Fletcher's story reveals the gap between what actually wins battles and what makes compelling narratives for public consumption. Halsey's aggressive personality and quotable bravado created better copy than Fletcher's methodical planning and risk assessment, even though Halsey's actual combat record included near disasters and costly mistakes. Spruance's tactical brilliance at Philippine Sea overshadowed that he commanded using Doctrine Fletcher helped develop at Coral Sea and Midway. The mythology of bold warriors conquering through sheer will makes better television than the reality of careful commanders balancing incomplete information, limited resources, and strategic constraints. Yet Fletcher's erasure from popular memory reflects not his failure, but history's preference for satisfying stories over complex truths. The question that opens this documentary demands an answer that challenges comfortable assumptions about military leadership and historical memory. Frank Jack Fletcher commanded more carrier battles than any American admiral in World War II, winning the engagements that determined whether the United States would hold the Pacific or lose it to Japanese expansion. He made decisions under pressure that few commanders ever face, operating with forces he couldn't replace and intelligence he couldn't verify, balancing risks that could lose the war against caution that might merely prolong it. His record demonstrates effectiveness without glory, victory without acclaim, service without recognition. In understanding why history forgot, Fletcher requires examining not just his battles, but the entire system of reputation, mythology, and institutional politics that determines who becomes a hero and who disappears into footnotes. This is the story of the admiral nobody remembers, and why that forgetting matters far beyond one man's legacy. The United States Naval Academy at Annapolis receives a new plebe in the summer of 1902, a young man from Kansas carrying a name that already echoes through the service. Frank Jack Fletcher arrives as the nephew of Commander Frank Friday Fletcher, an officer whose aggressive leadership in minor expeditionary operations has caught the attention of senior admirals and politicians seeking officers who embody American power in the new century. The younger Fletcher understands immediately that his name creates expectations he may never fulfill, that every superior officer will compare him to an uncle whose career trajectory seems destined for flag rank and historical significance. The weight settles on shoulders not yet 20 years old, shaping how he approaches every aspect of naval education and early service. He studies hard rather than brilliantly, follows regulations precisely rather than creatively, builds a reputation for reliability rather than inspiration. Classmates and instructors note his competence without enthusiasm, marking him as solid material for a career that would never quite reach the heights his famous relative would achieve. The Naval Academy of the early 20th century trains officers for a navy in transition, a caught between the coal-fired battleships that won the Spanish-American War and the oil-burning dreadnoughts that would define the coming decades. Fletcher graduates in 1906, ranking in the middle of his class, commissioned as an ensign into a service beginning to embrace the theories of Alfred Thayer Mahan about sea power and decisive battle. His early assignments follow the standard pattern for unremarkable but competent junior officers: destroyer duty in the Atlantic, gunnery practice in the Caribbean, routine patrols that teach seamanship and watchkeeping without offering opportunities for distinction. The routine breaks in April 1914, when political crisis in Mexico escalates into armed intervention. And Ensign Fletcher finds himself assigned to his uncle's command for the operation that will define both their careers in vastly different ways. The intervention at Veracruz in April 1914 puts Frank Jack Fletcher on the beach alongside his uncle during what becomes a confused, violent affair that earns the elder Fletcher a Medal of Honor. American sailors and Marines storm ashore to seize the customs house and prevent weapons shipments to the Huerta government, facing unexpectedly fierce resistance from Mexican defenders and armed civilians. The younger Fletcher serves as a junior officer managing logistics and communications, watching his uncle command under fire with the aggressive decisiveness that makes superior officers take notice. The elder Fletcher earns his medal for personally leading an assault that captures a critical defensive position, the kind of visible heroism that translates into promotion and increased responsibility. Frank Jack earns no decorations, receives no special recognition, returns to routine duty with the knowledge that his uncle's achievement has widened rather than narrowed the gap between their careers. The lesson embeds itself deeply. Bold action brings glory. Competent support brings nothing. The contrast between the two Fletchers sharpens over the following decades as the elder rises toward flag rank, while the younger progresses through the normal career ladder. Frank Friday. Fletcher commands destroyers, then cruisers, then destroyer squadrons, earning reputation as an aggressive sea dog, willing to take risks for decisive results. Next, Frank Jack Fletcher follows a parallel track, but never quite matches his uncle's visibility, commanding destroyers and cruisers with thoroughness rather than flair. The elder Fletcher becomes known for snap decisions and offensive spirit. the younger for careful planning and attention to detail. Both approaches serve the peacetime Navy adequately, but institutional culture favors the bold over the methodical, rewarding officers whose personalities match romantic ideals of naval leadership. When the elder Fletcher pins on his rear admiral's stars in the 1920s, the achievement casts a shadow over his nephew's steady but unspectacular progress through the ranks. The Naval War College in Newport becomes crucial to understanding how Frank Jack Fletcher approaches naval warfare differently than his celebrated uncle. But Fletcher attends the senior course in the late 1920s, immersing himself in studies of the Battle of Jutland and the theories of fleet tactics that dominate American naval thinking. The college's curriculum emphasizes careful analysis over aggressive action, teaching officers to appreciate the complexity of modern naval combat, where a single mistake can doom an entire fleet. Fletcher absorbs these lessons thoroughly, studying how British Admiral Jellicoe at Jutland chose caution over aggression because losing the Grand Fleet would lose the war, while German Admiral Scheer's boldness nearly produced catastrophic defeat. The case studies reinforce Fletcher's natural inclinations toward methodical planning and risk assessment, all creating an intellectual framework that will later govern his carrier command decisions, in ways that critics will misunderstand as timidity rather than wisdom. The elder Fletcher's death in 1928 removes the immediate personal comparison, but intensifies the institutional expectations. Frank Friday. Fletcher dies while serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, his career having reached the heights of American naval command. Obituaries celebrate his aggressive leadership and decisive action, establishing a narrative that the Fletcher name means bold warriors willing to take risks for victory. Frank Jack Fletcher, now a captain commanding cruisers, inherits both the legacy and the implicit demand that he live up to it. His fitness reports note solid performance and reliability, but lack the enthusiastic endorsements that propel officers into the highest ranks. Superiors appreciate his competence without championing his promotion, seeing him as excellent material for important but unglamorous assignments. The pattern suggests a career that will end respectably as a rear admiral commanding a cruiser division, possibly a battleship division, if fortune and politics align, but never ascending to the theater command his uncle briefly held. The 1930s find Fletcher commanding cruisers in the Pacific Fleet, executing the routine patrols and training exercises that prepare the Navy for a war many officers see approaching. His commands run efficiently, his ships score well on gunnery exercises. His officers respect him without forming the personal bonds that create loyal political factions. Fletcher remains a surface warfare specialist, his entire career focused on cruisers and destroyers, with no experience in aviation beyond the cursory exposure all senior officers receive. The omission becomes critical as the Navy transitions toward carrier-centric doctrine, developing the tactics and procedures that will govern the next war. Fletcher watches younger officers specialize in aviation, sees the Navy building carriers to replace battleships as primary striking power, recognizes that future flag rank will increasingly require aviation expertise he doesn't possess. His career path seems set toward competent obscurity, commanding surface forces in minor roles, while aviation specialists take the positions of real importance. Ours December 7, 1941, finds Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher at sea, commanding a task force built around the carrier Enterprise, escorting Marine reinforcements toward Wake Island. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor reaches Fletcher through radio reports that transform the Pacific and his career simultaneously. Fletcher receives orders to turn back, abandoning the Wake garrison to its fate, preserving Enterprise for future battles the Navy cannot yet imagine. The decision comes from Admiral Husband Kimmel, Fletcher's Naval Academy classmate, now disgraced commander of the Pacific Fleet, making choices in the chaos of disaster. Fletcher obeys immediately, reversing course toward Pearl Harbor, arriving days later to see the devastation firsthand. The sunken battleships, the wrecked aircraft, the shattered confidence of a fleet that thought itself invulnerable. All of it reshapes what the Pacific War will become and what kind of commanders it will need. The promotion to carrier command comes not through Fletcher's expertise in aviation, but through desperate necessity. the Navy possesses only 4 operational carriers in the Pacific after the attack: Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, and Yorktown. Every other battleship-oriented flag officer suddenly becomes irrelevant as the war transforms into carrier versus carrier combat that no American commander has ever fought. Fletcher receives command of the Yorktown Task Force in late December 1941, becoming responsible for a weapons system he barely understands and tactics that don't yet exist in any manual. His staff includes aviation specialists who know carriers but lack command experience, while Fletcher brings command experience but lacks aviation knowledge. The combination creates a command team that must learn while fighting, developing carrier doctrine through trial and error against an enemy who has spent years perfecting these very tactics. The weight of legacy compounds with the weight of responsibility as Fletcher prepares for his first carrier offensive operation. He commands a ship named for the critical Revolutionary War siege, carrying aircraft flown by pilots who graduated flight school months ago, protected by destroyers burning fuel he cannot easily replace. His uncle's aggressive spirit seems to whisper from memory, demanding bold action and offensive spirit, all while his own training at the War College counsels caution and careful assessment. The contradiction between what Fletcher knows he should do and what his superiors expect him to do creates tension that will define his entire combat career. He must be aggressive enough to satisfy commanders who measure success by enemy ships sunk, yet careful enough to preserve carriers America cannot replace until mid-1943 at earliest. The impossible balance between boldness and preservation, between his uncle's legacy and his own judgment, begins its test in the dark waters of the Pacific, where mistakes cost not just careers, but possibly the war itself. Task Force 17 approaches the Marshall Islands before dawn on February 1, 1942, that 8 weeks after Pearl Harbor transformed the Pacific War into a desperate scramble for any offensive action that might restore American morale. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stands on the bridge of the carrier Yorktown, watching darkness give way to gray light over waters the Japanese have controlled since the First World War. The task force includes Enterprise under Vice Admiral William Halsey, operating separately. The 2 carrier groups coordinating strikes against Japanese bases scattered across the Marshalls. Fletcher's orders come directly from Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor: attack enemy installations, inflict maximum damage, and return safely. The simplicity of those orders masks the complexity of executing the first American carrier offensive of the Pacific War, a raid into waters dominated by Japanese land-based aircraft and defended by forces whose strength remains largely unknown. The planning for the Marshall's operation reveals Fletcher's methodical approach to problems that have no established solutions in American carrier doctrine. He studies charts showing Japanese airfields at Jaluit, Mili, Makin, and Kwajalein, calculating distances and fuel consumption with precision that surprises staff officers accustomed to battleship admirals who delegate such details to subordinates. Fletcher wants to know exactly how long his destroyers can operate at various speeds, precisely how much fuel remains for emergency maneuvers, specifically how far the task force will be from the nearest replenishment point when aircraft return from strikes. Yet his operations officer suggests that such detailed calculations might be excessive for a simple raid, that the admiral should focus on target selection and damage assessment rather than logistics. Fletcher disagrees in his quiet, firm manner, explaining that fuel determines everything in carrier operations, that ships without fuel are targets rather than weapons, that knowing exact margins makes the difference between calculated risk and reckless gambling. The first strikes launch at dawn, 90 aircraft lifting from Yorktown and Enterprise to hit targets across the Marshalls in coordinated attacks designed to catch Japanese forces unprepared. Fletcher watches the launch operations with attention that focuses on recovery procedures rather than attack results. And thinking ahead to the most vulnerable phase when aircraft return damaged and low on fuel, the raids achieve complete surprise. American dive bombers and torpedo planes striking Japanese installations before defenders can organize effective resistance. Bombs fall on hangars, fuel dumps, and anchored shipping, while anti-aircraft fire remains scattered and ineffective. Pilots return with reports of fires burning across multiple islands, of Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, of ships sinking in shallow harbors. The damage assessment suggests a successful operation by any measure, but Fletcher's attention remains on the broader tactical picture rather than the immediate results. The request for follow-up strikes comes within hours of the first attack. 80 staff officers and air group commanders arguing that the Japanese remain disorganized and additional strikes could inflict even greater damage. Fletcher listens to the proposals while consulting fuel reports and radio intercepts that paint a different picture than his enthusiastic subordinates see. His destroyers have consumed fuel at rates higher than peacetime exercises suggested, operating at sustained high speeds that protect against submarine attack, but drain tanks faster than planned. Radio intercepts indicate Japanese forces at Kwajalein preparing a major air counterattack, land-based bombers that outrange carrier aircraft, and could strike the task force before Fletcher could withdraw beyond their reach. The calculations stack against additional strikes. Destroyers at 50% fuel capacity, at 600 miles from the nearest tanker, Japanese bomber bases 200 miles away, with clear weather providing perfect attack conditions. The decision Fletcher makes establishes a pattern that will define his reputation and career. He orders the task force to withdraw immediately, declining requests for additional strikes, prioritizing carrier preservation over target destruction. The air group commanders accept the order with visible disappointment. Pilots who tasted success wanting to press the attack while the enemy reels. Fletcher's staff understands his reasoning, but recognizes how this will look to superiors in Pearl Harbor, who measure success by enemy casualties rather than forces preserved. The withdrawal proceeds smoothly, in the task force steaming southeast away from the marshals, while Japanese bombers search waters where American carriers no longer operate. The tactic works perfectly. No Japanese aircraft locate the American carriers. No bombs fall on vulnerable flight decks. No pilots die in defensive battles against superior numbers. Fletcher brings every ship and nearly every aircraft back to Pearl Harbor. A success by preservation standards, but something less impressive by aggressive action standards. The after-action assessment in Pearl Harbor reveals the disconnect between Fletcher's careful approach and what his superiors expected from the operation. Nimitz praises the raid's success in striking the first American blow against Japanese-held territory, noting in his official report that the Marshals' operation demonstrated American capability to project power across the Pacific. Private communications show a different assessment, Nimitz writing in his personal diary, that Fletcher seemed overly cautious in withdrawing so quickly, that additional strikes might have inflicted substantially greater damage, that bolder action would better serve American strategic needs. Admiral Ernest King in Washington receives reports of the Marshals' raid with similar mixed feelings, pleased that offensive action occurred, but disappointed that Fletcher didn't maximize the opportunity. King's assessment uses language that will become familiar. Successful operation but timid execution, adequate results but insufficient aggressiveness, competent commander but lacking offensive spirit. The strategic context that Fletcher's critics overlook makes his caution comprehensible, even if not heroic. The United States possesses exactly 3 operational carriers in the Pacific at this moment: Yorktown, Enterprise, and Lexington, with Saratoga under repair after torpedo damage. Japan operates 6 fleet carriers, plus numerous light carriers and seaplane tenders, enjoying numerical superiority that permits aggressive actions Americans cannot match. Losing a single American carrier in February 1942 would shift the balance so decisively toward Japan that recovery might prove impossible before mid-1943 when new construction reaches the fleet. Fletcher grasps this arithmetic, even if his superiors in safer positions think in terms of aggressive action rather than force preservation. His fuel calculations reflect not timidity, but accurate assessment of operational limitations that aggressive commanders often ignore until crisis forces recognition. The pattern established at the Marshals repeats itself through subsequent operations, as Fletcher commands additional raids against Japanese positions. A strike against Wake Island in late February follows the same template. Successful attack, withdrawal before follow-up strikes, criticism for insufficient aggression. A raid against Marcus Island in March produces identical results and identical assessments. Fletcher's task forces consistently accomplish their assigned objectives without losing carriers, but the victories lack the decisive quality that makes headlines or impresses superiors looking for bold warriors rather than careful tacticians. His reputation solidifies as competent but uninspiring, reliable but not brilliant, an admiral who gets the job done without getting it done dramatically. The statistical reality that should vindicate Fletcher's approach remains invisible to critics judging by different standards. His task forces lose minimal aircraft during these raids, suffering casualties measured in single digits rather than dozens. His fuel calculations prove accurate, with destroyers returning to base with exactly the margins Fletcher predicted, rather than running dry or having excessive reserves. His intelligence assessments correctly identified Japanese air strength and positioning, avoiding the ambushes that more aggressive commanders might blunder into while seeking glory. The carriers themselves suffer no damage during these early operations, in remaining ready for the major battles that will determine the Pacific War's outcome. Fletcher's caution preserves the forces that will fight at Coral Sea and Midway, but the preservation itself earns no credit from a Navy culture that values aggressive action over careful management. The contrast between Fletcher and Halsey sharpens during these early months of carrier warfare. The two admirals commanding parallel operations with different styles that produce different reputations, despite similar results. Halsey's raids against the Gilberts and Marshalls receive enthusiastic press coverage emphasizing bold action and fighting spirit, while Fletcher's operations earn professional respect without public acclaim. Halsey's pilots describe their commander as aggressive and inspiring. Fletcher's pilots describe theirs as competent and careful. The institutional Navy begins making judgments that will shape future assignments and promotions, identifying Halsey as the warrior admiral America needs, while viewing Fletcher as merely adequate for less critical assignments. The judgments reflect institutional bias toward bold personalities over effective management, toward quotable aggression over mathematical precision, toward commanders who look like heroes rather than those who win without drama. Fletcher's first blood in the Marshalls reveals both his strengths and the perception problems those strengths create in a military culture, unprepared to value the unglamorous competence that will actually win the carrier war. The operations order for the Wake Island raid arrives at Fletcher's flagship in early March 1942, in another in the series of hit-and-run attacks designed to keep pressure on Japanese forces, while America mobilizes for sustained offensive operations. Fletcher reads the order with attention focused less on target details than on the logistics appendix that most flag officers delegate to staff. His operations officer finds him after midnight in the flag plotting room, surrounded by fuel consumption charts and distance calculations, working through the mathematics that govern carrier task force operations in ways that textbooks never adequately explain. Fletcher wants to know precisely how long each destroyer can operate at 25 knots versus 30 knots, exactly how much fuel tanker operations consume while underway, specifically how weather conditions affect consumption rates that peacetime exercises measured under ideal conditions. The obsession with logistics strikes his staff as excessive for an admiral commanding combat operations. But Fletcher insists on understanding the margins that separate successful raids from disasters caused by ships dead in the water. The fuel calculations reveal limitations that aggressive planning tends to ignore or minimize. A destroyer operating at sustained high speed for screening operations burns through 75% of fuel capacity within 3 days, leaving minimal reserves for combat maneuvering or emergency situations. Fleet oilers capable of refueling task forces at sea number only 7 in the entire Pacific Fleet, are creating bottlenecks that restrict how long carrier groups can operate without returning to base. The refueling operation itself requires 4 to 6 hours of steaming at predictable speeds and courses, transforming the task force into a nearly stationary target vulnerable to submarine attack or airstrikes. Fletcher calculates that every carrier operation must plan backward from fuel availability rather than forward from offensive opportunities. That logistics determines strategy more fundamentally than commanders comfortable with battleship warfare understand. His staff watches him work through scenarios that seem overly pessimistic, questioning whether the admiral's caution might prevent achieving objectives that bolder action could accomplish. The Wake Island raid proceeds according to Fletcher's careful plan, launching strikes that inflict damage without exhausting the margins he considers essential for safety. Japanese installations take bomb damage, shore facilities burn, but Fletcher declines requests to extend the operation beyond the time frame his fuel calculations support. Air group commanders argue that targets remain and aircraft stand ready, that additional strikes could inflict substantially greater damage, that the enemy seems unable to mount effective resistance. Fletcher listens to the arguments while consulting updated fuel reports showing destroyers approaching the 50% threshold he considers minimum acceptable reserve. He explains his reasoning in staff meetings that leave subordinates understanding the mathematics without fully accepting the conclusions. Even that preserving force for future operations outweighs maximizing damage in current engagements, that running out of fuel transforms a successful raid into a potential disaster. The task force withdraws on schedule, every ship returning safely to Pearl Harbor, the operation succeeding by Fletcher's conservative metrics, even if it disappoints those hoping for more aggressive results. The Marcus Island operation in March follows an identical pattern that hardens perceptions of Fletcher as excessively cautious. The raid accomplishes its objectives of striking Japanese facilities and demonstrating American reach, but post-operation meetings reveal growing frustration among air group commanders who believe Fletcher doesn't let them finish the job. Pilots trained for aggressive combat find themselves pulled back from targets before exhausting attack opportunities, returning to carriers with ordnance remaining and fuel sufficient for additional strikes. The complaints reach Pearl Harbor through unofficial channels, junior officers writing letters that describe their admiral as competent but timid, effective but uninspiring, successful by minimal standards rather than maximum achievement. The informal assessment builds a narrative that Fletcher's superiors begin to accept, despite his unblemished operational record, that caution has become excessive, that preservation has become an end rather than a means. The contrast between Fletcher and Halsey intensifies as both admirals conduct similar operations, with vastly different public reception. Halsey's raids receive coverage emphasizing bold strikes and fighting spirit, his pilots describing operations where they pressed attacks to the limit of fuel and ordnance. Fletcher's identical operations receive less attention and more qualified assessment, professional respect for accomplishing objectives without generating the excitement that captures institutional imagination. The difference reflects less the actual results than the style and personality each commander projects. Halsey's aggressive quotations and visible command presence creating a warrior image that Fletcher's quiet competence cannot match. Both admirals bring their task forces home without losing carriers. Both accomplish assigned objectives, but institutional culture reads those parallel achievements through filters that favor bold personalities over methodical planning. The fuel logistics that obsess Fletcher prove even more constrained than peacetime estimates suggested, vindicating his caution in ways that critics rarely acknowledge. Actual combat operations consume fuel at rates 15 to 20% higher than exercises indicated. Destroyers burning through reserves faster than planning documents assumed when calculating operational ranges. The Pacific Fleet possesses insufficient tankers to support sustained operations by multiple carrier task forces simultaneously, creating competition for resources that limits how aggressively any single task force can operate. Weather conditions in the Central Pacific prove less favorable than assumed, requiring higher speeds and more maneuvering than ideal condition calculations suggested. Fletcher's detailed fuel logs demonstrate that his conservative estimates actually match reality better than the optimistic assumptions other commanders employ. But the vindication comes in spreadsheets rather than dramatic action, in preserved forces rather than headlines. The doctrine Fletcher develops through these early operations becomes foundational for American carrier warfare, despite receiving minimal credit at the time. His insistence that carriers avoid operating more than 48 hours steaming from the nearest fuel source establishes a principle that later commanders will follow without acknowledging the source. His careful calculation of destroyer screening requirements balances protection against fuel consumption, made determining the optimal task force composition that becomes standard practice. His emphasis on preserving carriers for future battles, rather than risking them for current targets, reflects strategic wisdom that the institutional Navy accepts slowly and incompletely. The contributions remain invisible because they manifest as doctrine and procedure rather than dramatic victories, as sustained effectiveness rather than bold gestures, as the unglamorous work of building systems that others will use to win more celebrated battles. The philosophical divide between Fletcher and his critics reflects fundamentally different understandings of carrier warfare in its earliest stages. Fletcher sees carriers as irreplaceable strategic assets requiring preservation, even at the cost of immediate opportunities. Fragile platforms whose loss would shift the Pacific balance decisively toward Japan. His superiors see carriers as weapons meant for aggressive employment, tools for striking the enemy rather than preserving for uncertain future engagements. Neither view is entirely wrong, but the tension between preservation and employment creates conflict that Fletcher's quiet personality cannot resolve through force of argument or political skill. He continues operating according to principles he believes correct, writing detailed after-action reports that explain his reasoning in technical language that fails to inspire or persuade readers looking for bold warriors rather than careful managers. The personal correspondence Fletcher maintains with other officers reveals a man aware of his reputation problems, but unwilling or unable to change his fundamental approach. He writes to a Naval Academy classmate that carriers are not battleships, that the Navy cannot trade punches with an enemy possessing numerical superiority, that preservation and employment must balance rather than treating aggressive action as the only acceptable strategy. The letter receives a sympathetic response, but no wider circulation, Fletcher's arguments remaining private rather than shaping institutional debate. His inability to build political support or cultivate media relationships limits his influence to the task forces he directly commands, preventing his methods from becoming recognized doctrine even as other commanders quietly adopt them. The pattern will continue through the major battles ahead, Fletcher developing tactics and procedures that others will use to win acclaim, while his own reputation suffers from the very caution that makes those later victories possible. The Marshall and Wake and Marcus raids establish Fletcher as a competent carrier admiral who achieves objectives without glory, a commander who brings ships home safely without creating the dramatic victories that institutional culture celebrates. His obsession with fuel and logistics seems excessive to critics who prefer bold action, but the mathematics underlying his caution will prove accurate when major battles force recognition that carriers cannot operate beyond their supply lines or risk losses America cannot replace. The foundation Fletcher builds through careful calculation and conservative operations provides the base from which American carrier power will strike decisive blows at Coral Sea and Midway, though the credit for those victories will flow to more dramatic commanders and the unglamorous work of logistics planning will fade into forgotten background details that make success possible without earning recognition. Radio intelligence reaches Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor in late April 1942, carrying information that transforms the Pacific War's strategic situation. Japanese forces are preparing a major offensive aimed at Port Moresby on New Guinea's southern coast, an operation that would position enemy bombers within range of Australia and potentially sever the supply lines keeping that critical ally in the war. Nimitz orders every available carrier toward the Coral Sea to intercept the Japanese thrust, assembling a task force that includes Yorktown under Fletcher's command and Lexington under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch. Fletcher receives overall tactical command despite Fitch's greater aviation experience, a decision that reflects Nimitz's confidence in Fletcher's operational judgment even as doubts about his aggressiveness persist. The orders come with unusual clarity. Stop the Port Moresby invasion regardless of cost, engage Japanese carriers if opportunity permits, preserve American carriers if possible, but accomplish the strategic mission above all else. Task Force 17, rendezvous south of the Solomon Islands on May 1, 1942, bringing together the two American carrier groups in waters where Japanese submarines and reconnaissance aircraft operate with increasing frequency. Fletcher meets with Fitch and Rear Admiral John Crace, commanding the cruiser support group, planning operations against an enemy whose exact composition and location remain uncertain, despite radio intelligence providing strategic warning. The intelligence officers brief that the Japanese force includes at least 2 fleet carriers, possibly the Shokaku and Zuikaku veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, plus numerous cruisers and destroyers escorting troop transports headed for Port Moresby. Fletcher must locate and strike this force somewhere in the vast Coral Sea while avoiding detection himself, executing carrier warfare's fundamental challenge of finding the enemy before the enemy finds you. The meeting produces a plan that reflects Fletcher's methodical approach: systematic search patterns, careful fuel management, coordinated strikes when targets appear, preservation of forces if the situation becomes untenable. The operation begins badly on May 4th, when Fletcher receives orders to strike Japanese forces landing at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, a secondary target that reveals his presence to enemy forces while accomplishing minimal strategic effect. Fletcher complies with the orders despite reservations, launching strikes from Yorktown that sink minor shipping and damage shore installations without significantly affecting Japanese plans. The Tulagi raid alerts the Japanese that American carriers operate in the area, eliminating the element of surprise Fletcher considers essential for successful operations. And radio intercepts confirm that Japanese commanders now know American carriers are nearby, shifting the tactical situation from ambush to mutual search and strike, where the first side to locate the enemy gains decisive advantage. Fletcher withdraws southward after the Tulagi strikes, rejoining Lexington and searching for the main Japanese carrier force he knows must be approaching Port Moresby. May 7th begins with both carrier forces searching blindly across the Coral Sea, launching reconnaissance aircraft into cloudy skies that conceal ships operating barely 200 miles apart. Fletcher receives a contact report at 800 hours that seems to solve the search problem: 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers located north of his position, a force description matching the main Japanese striking group. He orders both American carriers to launch full strikes immediately, committing his entire available air strength to an attack he believes will cripple the Japanese offensive. The decision reflects exactly the aggressive action his superiors have criticized him for lacking: a bold commitment based on fragmentary reconnaissance that could prove incorrect. 93 aircraft lift from Yorktown and Lexington, forming up for a strike that will either vindicate Fletcher's judgment or expose him to criticism for attacking the wrong target. The strike force locates its target at 1100 hours and discovers that the contact report was catastrophically wrong. The 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers proved to be 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers, a minor force whose destruction accomplishes nothing strategic while leaving American carriers without aircraft when the real Japanese fleet finally appears. Fletcher faces the possibility that he has committed the exact error he spent months avoiding, launching aggressively at inadequate intelligence rather than waiting for confirmation. Then, fortune shifts unexpectedly. Scouts locate the light carrier, Shoho, operating separately from the main Japanese force, providing the strike force with an actual carrier target despite the navigational error. American dive bombers and torpedo planes converge on Shoho, overwhelming her defenses with concentrated attack. The carrier takes 13 bomb and 7 torpedo hits, sinking within minutes while her crew abandons ship. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon radios the signal that becomes famous: "Scratch 1 flat top." The first Japanese carrier, sunk in combat, goes down to a strike launched on bad intelligence that happened to find a worthwhile target through sheer luck. The remainder of May 7th demonstrates carrier warfare's fundamental unpredictability as both sides search for each other, while weather and distance create near-miss encounters. Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku operate under radio silence northeast of Fletcher's position, their aircraft searching the same cloudy skies where American scouts hunt for targets. Neither force locates the other, despite operating within strike range throughout the afternoon. Both Fletcher and his Japanese counterpart, Admiral Takagi, making decisions based on incomplete information and educated guesses. In late afternoon brings a bizarre incident that reveals how close the forces have approached. A Japanese strike force attempting to attack what they believe is an American carrier group instead locates Fletcher's actual carriers by accident. Several Japanese aircraft attempting to land on Yorktown in the gathering darkness before recognizing their error. The incident demonstrates that the two carrier forces are nearly within visual range. That nightfall on May 7th arrives with both sides positioned for decisive battle the following morning. The night of May 7th finds Fletcher planning for the engagement he knows will come at dawn, coordinating with Fitch while staff officers prepare search patterns and strike packages. The intelligence picture remains frustratingly incomplete. 80 Japanese carriers located somewhere northeast of American position, but exact coordinates unknown. Fletcher faces the same challenge that confronted him at the Marshalls and Wake Island, but magnified by higher stakes. Commit forces aggressively with incomplete information, or wait for better reconnaissance and risk the enemy striking first. His decision reflects lessons from the day's near misses. Launch searches at first light, prepare strike forces for immediate launch upon contact, maintain defensive combat air patrol strength, in case Japanese scouts locate American carriers before American scouts find theirs. The plan represents Fletcher's evolving doctrine, balancing aggressive action against careful preparation, accepting calculated risk rather than either reckless attack or excessive caution. The strategic context that makes Coral Sea critical extends far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the waters northeast of Australia. The Port Moresby invasion represents Japan's last major offensive opportunity in the South Pacific, a chance to complete the defensive perimeter that would force America into costly island-hopping campaigns through heavily fortified positions. Stopping the invasion requires either sinking the troop transports directly or crippling the carrier force that protects them, tasks that require Fletcher to risk his carriers in restricted waters against potentially superior forces. The arithmetic remains brutally unfavorable. Losing one American carrier shifts the Pacific balance significantly toward Japan, while sinking one Japanese carrier barely affects their overall strength. Fletcher must achieve victory without accepting the kind of casualties that more aggressive commanders might consider acceptable, maintaining the impossible balance between bold action and force preservation that defines his entire operational approach. The human dimension of Coral Sea emerges in the pilots preparing for morning strikes. Young men who have trained for months but never fought the kind of desperate carrier battle that morning will bring. They attend briefings where intelligence officers admit uncertainty about enemy positions, listen to air group commanders explain attack procedures for targets they may not find, return to ready rooms, understanding that tomorrow will test every assumption about carrier warfare. Fletcher's pilots describe their admiral as competent but distant. A commander who explains his reasoning in the technical terms rather than inspiring speeches, who emphasizes fuel management and search patterns rather than aggressive spirit. The relationship lacks the personal connection that Halsey cultivates with his air groups, but pilots respect Fletcher's professionalism even if they don't feel the emotional bond that comes from charismatic leadership. Tomorrow will determine whether Fletcher's careful approach or more aggressive doctrine better serves the desperate circumstances of carrier combat between numerically mismatched forces. The question that hangs over Task Force 17 as May 7th ends is whether Fletcher's methodical style can produce the decisive victory that the strategic situation demands and his superiors expect. He has maneuvered successfully, they positioned his carriers adequately, achieved the minor success of sinking Shoho, but the main Japanese carriers remain intact and dangerous. Morning will bring the clash that Fletcher has spent the entire war preparing for, the carrier versus carrier battle that will prove whether his cautious doctrine reflects wisdom or timidity, whether his fuel calculations and careful planning produce better results than bold aggression and calculated gambling. The fate of the Port Moresby invasion, the security of Australia, possibly the entire Pacific War's outcome, depends on decisions Fletcher will make in the next hours, balancing incomplete information against urgent necessity, aggressive action against force preservation, his judgment against the expectations of superiors who doubt whether he possesses the offensive spirit to win the kind of battle that carrier warfare demands. Dawn breaks over the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, with both carrier forces launching search aircraft into skies that promise the decisive engagement neither side managed to achieve the previous day. Fletcher's search planes lift from Yorktown and Lexington at 600 hours, fanning out to cover the sectors where intelligence suggests Japanese carriers lurk somewhere beyond visual range. Admiral Takagi launches his own searches from Shokaku and Zuikaku simultaneously, both commanders executing identical procedures that reflect carrier warfare's fundamental dynamic. Find the enemy before he finds you, strike first before he strikes you. All survive the exchange that will determine which fleet retains control of these contested waters. The searches operate in weather that shifts between clear skies and tropical squalls, visibility varying from unlimited to nearly zero within miles, creating conditions where luck matters as much as skill in locating targets operating across vast ocean spaces. The critical sighting comes at 815 hours when a scout from Lexington radios contact with 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers, the exact force composition Fletcher has been seeking since entering the Coral Sea. The coordinates place the Japanese carriers approximately 170 miles northeast of the American task force, well within strike range for both sides' aircraft. Fletcher and Fitch make the decision to launch immediately, in committing their full striking power before the Japanese can locate American carriers and execute their own attack. Within minutes, flight deck crews begin spotting aircraft for launch, dive bombers and torpedo planes loading ordnance while fighters prepare to escort the strike force. The launch proceeds with practiced efficiency despite the pressure everyone feels, knowing that Japanese pilots may even now be manning aircraft to strike American carriers while Fletcher's attack flies toward Japanese targets. 75 American aircraft lift from Yorktown and Lexington between 8:30 and 900 hours, forming into coordinated groups that will execute the attack doctrine American carrier aviation has developed through training exercises that never quite captured combat's chaos and violence. The strike force includes dive bombers carrying 1,000-pound bombs designed to penetrate carrier flight decks, torpedo planes carrying the temperamental Mark 13 torpedoes that often fail to detonate but sometimes sink ships with single hits, and fighters assigned to strafe or protect the attack aircraft from Japanese combat air patrol. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon leads the Lexington group, while Lieutenant Commander William Birch commands Yorktown squadrons, both men experienced aviators executing a mission, type they have practiced but never performed, against an enemy shooting back with full intensity. The flight north proceeds through alternating weather, strike groups maintaining formation, while navigating toward coordinates that may have changed since the original sighting report. The Japanese strike launches almost simultaneously from Shokaku and Zuikaku, 69 aircraft heading south toward American carriers that Japanese scouts located minutes after Fletcher's scouts found the Japanese force. The near-simultaneous detection creates the situation carrier theorists predicted, but no one has yet experienced: 2 carrier forces launching full strikes at each other, aircraft passing mid-ocean, while headed for targets each side hopes to destroy before enemy strikes arrive. Admiral Takagi commits his entire available striking power just as Fletcher has done, both commanders making identical calculations that offense provides better defense than combat air patrol in carrier warfare's brutal mathematics. The Japanese pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and raids across the Pacific, that fly toward American carriers confident in their training and experience, while Fletcher's largely inexperienced aviators navigate toward targets they hope to find before fuel limitations force return to base. The American strike locates Shokaku at 10:57 hours, the Japanese carrier maneuvering in clear weather that provides perfect attack conditions. Dive bombers push over from 14,000 feet, while torpedo planes separate for attacks from multiple angles, executing coordinated assault doctrine that American carriers have practiced without knowing whether it would work against an enemy whose anti-aircraft fire fills the sky with deadly patterns. Shokaku's crew fights their ship with skill that reflects Japan's professional naval tradition, firing every weapon that bears while the carrier maneuvers violently to evade incoming ordnance. The attack achieves partial success, 3,000-pound bombs hit Shokaku's flight deck, tearing massive holes that prevent further aircraft operations, but failing to detonate the magazines or fuel stores that would sink the ship outright. Fires rage across the damaged carrier, but damage control parties contain them, while the ship maintains speed and begins limping toward Japanese bases for repairs that will keep her out of the war for crucial months. The attack on Zuikaku fails entirely when that carrier disappears into a rain squall that provides perfect concealment from dive bombers requiring clear visibility for accurate attacks. American pilots search the area where Zuikaku should be, fuel gauges dropping toward minimum return levels, all weather obscuring their target so completely that many pilots never even see the carrier they hope to sink. The frustrated squadrons turn south toward their own carriers, some pilots nursing damaged aircraft toward home, while others recalculate fuel and worry whether they will reach Yorktown or Lexington before engines quit. The attack results demonstrate carrier warfare's unpredictability. Shokaku badly damaged but surviving, Zuikaku completely undamaged but lucky rather than skillful in finding protective weather. Fletcher's strike accomplished objectives without achieving the decisive success that might have crippled Japanese carrier power permanently. The Japanese strike reaches Task Force 17 at 1113 hours, while American aircraft are still returning from their attack, creating the chaotic situation where carriers must land their own planes while defending against incoming enemies. Lexington and Yorktown maneuver independently, each carrier surrounded by screening cruisers and destroyers whose anti-aircraft fire creates protective patterns that Japanese pilots must penetrate. The Combat Air Patrol engages Japanese fighters and bombers with intensity that matches anything American pilots have experienced, shooting down multiple attackers but failing to prevent determined Japanese aviators from pressing attacks through defensive fire. Lexington takes 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits in rapid succession, the carrier shuddering under impacts that tear into hull and flight deck, but initially failing to slow the ship or prevent continued operations. Yorktown suffers 1 bomb hit that penetrates to the 4th deck before exploding, killing and wounding dozens, but leaving the carrier operational. The attack ends by 11:45 hours, Japanese survivors withdrawing toward their own carriers while American damage control parties assess the destruction and begin repairs. Lexington appears badly hurt, but functional, fires burning but seemingly under control, flight deck damaged but still capable of landing aircraft. Captain Frederick Sherman maintains speed and begins recovering aircraft, while damage control teams work below decks to contain flooding and extinguish fires. Yorktown's damage seems manageable, the single bomb hit creating localized destruction without threatening the ship's survival. And Fletcher watches the recovery operations while receiving damage reports that suggest both carriers will remain operational, despite the battering they absorbed. The exchange appears roughly even. Shokaku damaged but surviving, Lexington and Yorktown hit but operational, both sides bloodied but neither decisively defeated. The disaster unfolds at 12:47 hours when massive explosions deep within Lexington announce that aviation gasoline vapors have ignited, creating internal fires that damage control cannot reach or suppress. The explosions repeat at intervals over the next hours, each blast tearing through compartments and killing crew members fighting to save their ship. And yet Captain Sherman maintains order, while engineers battle to contain damage spreading through spaces filled with explosive vapors from fuel lines ruptured by torpedo hits. Fletcher watches from Yorktown as Lexington's situation deteriorates from controllable damage to catastrophic failure, the carrier transforming from operational warship to dying hulk despite every effort to save her. By evening, Sherman receives permission to abandon ship, ordering crew members over the side while destroyers approach to rescue survivors. The decision to scuttle Lexington comes at 19:15 hours when Admiral Fitch, having transferred his flag to a cruiser, authorizes the destroyer Phelps to torpedo the burning carrier and prevent her capture or prolonged death. 5 torpedoes strike the doomed ship, sending Lexington to the bottom of the Coral Sea, along with 216 men killed during the battle and subsequent explosions. Fletcher watches the carrier sink, understanding the implications for his reputation and the Pacific Fleet's strength. He has lost a fleet carrier in combat, reducing American carrier strength to 3 operational flat ops against Japan's remaining 5 or 6. The tactical balance sheet shows 1 Japanese light carrier sunk against 1 American fleet carrier lost, a trade that favors Japan numerically, even though the strategic objective of stopping the Port Moresby invasion has been achieved. The victory rings hollow as Lexington disappears beneath the waves, flames visible for miles marking the spot where American carrier strength suffered its first major loss of the war. The aftermath of Coral Sea leaves Fletcher commanding a damaged Yorktown steaming toward Pearl Harbor, knowing his performance will face harsh judgment despite achieving the strategic mission. He stopped the Port Moresby invasion. The Japanese troop convoy turned back permanently, never again attempting to capture the base that would threaten Australia. He damaged Shokaku badly enough to remove her from combat for 2 crucial months. He bloodied Zuikaku's air group so severely that the carrier cannot operate effectively, despite escaping physical damage. But he lost Lexington, a fleet carrier America cannot replace until new construction reaches the fleet in mid-1943. And the arithmetic of carrier preservation that Fletcher emphasized for months now works against him. Losing one of 4 carriers represents catastrophic loss percentage regardless of strategic gains achieved. The battle proves both Fletcher's competence in achieving objectives and his vulnerability to criticism when outcomes deviate from perfect preservation, setting the stage for assessments that will question whether a more aggressive commander might have achieved better results at lower cost. The after-action conference in Admiral Chester Nimitz's office at Pearl Harbor convenes on May 15, 1942, 1 week after Coral Sea ended with Lexington at the bottom and Yorktown limping home for repairs. Fletcher sits across from Nimitz and the staff officers who will analyze his performance. Knowing the meeting will determine whether he retains carrier command or joins the growing list of admirals relieved for failing to meet standards that shift with each engagement. The atmosphere lacks the celebratory quality that should accompany the first battle where American forces stopped a Japanese offensive, the mood sobered by Lexington's loss, and questions about whether different decisions might have produced better outcomes. Nimitz begins with congratulations for stopping Port Moresby's invasion before shifting to detailed examination of tactical choices, timing of strikes, and the decisions that led to losing a fleet carrier America desperately needs for future operations. Fletcher's report demonstrates his characteristic thoroughness without offering excuses or deflecting criticism towards subordinates or circumstances. He describes the intelligence situation that left him searching blindly on May 7th, the faulty contact report that led to launching strikes at wrong coordinates, the good fortune of finding Shoho despite navigational errors. He explains the decision to launch full strikes on May 8th based on confirmed locations of Japanese carriers, acknowledging that simultaneous strikes meant Lexington and Yorktown had to defend themselves with reduced combat air patrol while their attack aircraft flew toward enemy targets. The bombing and torpedoing of Lexington resulted from tactical choices inherent in carrier warfare. Offense requires committing aircraft that could instead defend. Defense means accepting risk that offense might prevent. Fletcher presents his decisions as reasonable given the information available and objectives assigned, in neither claiming brilliance nor accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond any commander's control. Nimitz's assessment balances recognition of strategic success against disappointment with tactical results, reflecting the mixed feelings that Coral Sea generates throughout the Pacific Command structure. The Port Moresby invasion stopped permanently represents a major strategic victory, removing the threat to Australia and forcing Japan onto defensive footing in the South Pacific for the first time since the war began. Damaging Shokaku and depleting Zuikaku's air group removes both carriers from availability for several months, reducing Japanese carrier strength at a critical moment. But losing Lexington shifts the carrier balance toward Japan numerically, leaving America with 3 operational flat ops against Japan's remaining strength. Nimitz writes in his official report that Fletcher accomplished his mission under difficult circumstances, demonstrating tactical competence and strategic understanding. His private diary entries reveal more ambiguous assessment, noting that Fletcher seemed hesitant in pursuing damaged Japanese carriers after the main engagement, that More aggressive follow-up might have sunk Shokaku or caught Zuikaku when she emerged from her protective squall. The assessment from Washington carries harsher judgment, as Admiral Ernest King evaluates Coral Sea through the lens of expectations that prioritize aggressive action over careful preservation. Yes, King's report to Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, describes the battle as a missed opportunity, where American forces failed to destroy the Japanese carrier force despite having surprise and intelligence advantages. Fletcher permitted the enemy to escape, King writes, launching strikes that damaged one carrier while allowing the other to withdraw unscathed, then failing to pursue with follow-up attacks that might have finished both Japanese carriers. The loss of Lexington appears in King's assessment as evidence of insufficient aggressiveness. A bold commander would have struck first and harder, destroying Japanese carriers before they could launch the strike that sank Lexington. King's language echoes his previous criticisms of Fletcher's marshals and wake operations, on establishing a pattern where Fletcher's tactical competence cannot overcome perception of insufficient offensive spirit. The debate over Fletcher's performance reflects deeper divisions within the Navy about what carrier warfare requires and what kind of commanders should lead carrier task forces. One faction, represented by Nimitz and some senior aviators, argues that Fletcher demonstrated exactly the right balance between aggression and preservation, achieving strategic objectives while keeping Yorktown operational for future battles. Losing Lexington resulted from tactical realities rather than command failure. Carrier warfare's simultaneous exchange, nature means accepting casualties while inflicting them, and Fletcher's decisions fell within acceptable parameters given mission requirements. The opposing faction, all led by King and younger aggressive officers, contends that Fletcher's caution prevented decisive victory, that bolder action on May 7th could have destroyed both Japanese carriers before they struck Lexington, that preservation has become an end rather than a means in Fletcher's operational philosophy. The political reality behind these assessments reveals institutional dynamics that matter as much as tactical performance in determining which admirals receive critical assignments. King wants aggressive commanders who match his vision of naval warfare as bold strikes and offensive action, officers whose personalities and reputations inspire confidence in political leaders demanding visible results. Fletcher's quiet competence and methodical approach failed to satisfy King's preference for warriors rather than managers. It is for admirals whose public image projects fighting spirit regardless of actual tactical effectiveness. Nimitz must balance King's demands for aggressive leadership against his own assessment that Fletcher understands carrier warfare better than critics who have never commanded at sea during combat operations. The tension between Washington's expectations and Pearl Harbor's tactical realities places Nimitz in the uncomfortable position of defending a subordinate whose results satisfy operational requirements without inspiring confidence in political superiors. The immediate consequence of Coral Sea appears in the repair priority assigned to Yorktown, damaged but operational carrier that becomes critical for the next major operation already looming on the intelligence horizon. Navy Yard Pearl Harbor estimates 90 days minimum for proper repairs to Yorktown's bomb damage, work that would keep the carrier out of action through August and leave America with only 2 operational carriers for the coming months. Nimitz cannot accept that timeline. Radio intelligence indicates a major Japanese offensive developing toward Midway, an operation that will require every available American carrier to defeat. He orders the Navy Yard to accomplish 90 days' work in 72 hours, repair crews working around the clock to patch Yorktown's wounds well enough for one more battle, even if proper repairs must wait until after that engagement. The compressed timeline reflects Nimitz's assessment that America cannot afford to lose Midway, that every carrier matters regardless of damage. That Fletcher will command Yorktown at the coming battle, despite questions about his aggressiveness. The decision to retain Fletcher in tactical command for Midway represents Nimitz's confidence in his subordinate, despite King's doubts and Coral Sea's mixed results. Nimitz assigns Fletcher overall command of the carrier forces at Midway, with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanding Enterprise and Hornet as a subordinate task group after Halsey falls ill with dermatitis. The assignment demonstrates Nimitz's judgment that Fletcher's tactical competence outweighs his perceived caution. that his experience in 2 major carrier battles provides expertise no other available admiral possesses, that his methodical planning style suits the Midway operation, where intelligence provides unprecedented knowledge of Japanese intentions. While Fletcher receives the assignment knowing it represents a chance for redemption or final confirmation of inadequacy, understanding that Midway will determine not just the Pacific War's strategic direction, but his own career trajectory. The intelligence breakthrough that shapes Midway planning comes from Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, where Commander Joseph Rochefort's codebreakers penetrate Japanese naval communications sufficiently to determine when, where, and with what forces Japan will attack. The intelligence reveals that Admiral Yamamoto plans a massive operation against Midway Island in early June, using 4 fleet carriers and supporting forces to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers in decisive battle. The Japanese assume American carriers remain in the South Pacific recovering from Coral Sea, that Yorktown sits damaged in Pearl Harbor requiring months of repair, that Enterprise and Hornet constitute the only American carriers capable of reaching Midway before the Japanese attack begins. The assumptions give Fletcher an advantage unprecedented in naval history. He knows the enemy's plan, timing, and force composition, while the enemy operates in ignorance of American knowledge and capabilities. The strategic context for Midway extends beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass the entire Pacific War's future direction. Japan seeks decisive battle to destroy American carrier power permanently, forcing the United States to accept negotiated peace that leaves Japan controlling the Western Pacific. Yet stopping the Midway operation requires not just defending the island, but inflicting casualties on Japanese carriers that will shift the balance toward America, damaging Japanese naval aviation so severely that they cannot mount future offensives. Fletcher must achieve this with 3 carriers against 4, with pilots who average months of experience against Japanese aviators who have been fighting since Pearl Harbor, with tactical doctrines still being developed while Japan operates with procedures refined through constant combat. The mathematics remain unfavorable even with intelligence advantages. Fletcher needs something approaching a perfect battle to win the kind of decisive victory that will vindicate his Coral Sea performance and silence critics who question his capacity for aggressive action. The human dimension of the reckoning Fletcher faces emerges in quiet moments between the official meetings and operational planning. Conversations with staff officers who understand their admiral's reputation hangs on the coming battle. Fletcher maintains his characteristic calm demeanor, neither expressing anxiety about King's criticism nor confidence about Midway's outcome, focusing instead on the practical details of coordinating 3 carrier task forces against a superior enemy force. His staff watches him work through scenarios and contingencies, calculating fuel requirements and search patterns, preparing for the battle that will either confirm his competence or end his carrier command career. The weight of expectation combines with tactical complexity to create pressure that Fletcher acknowledges privately while maintaining the professional calm that has characterized his entire career, preparing for Midway with the methodical thoroughness that may finally receive the recognition it deserves, or may prove insufficient against critics determined to see caution rather than wisdom in every decision he makes. Commander Joseph Rochefort stands before Admiral Chester Nimitz and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher at Pacific Fleet Headquarters on May 25, 1942, presenting intelligence that transforms the strategic situation from desperate defense to calculated ambush. Station Hypo's codebreakers have penetrated Japanese naval communications deeply enough to provide details that seem almost too good to be true. The Japanese will attack Midway Island on June 4th with 4 fleet carriers under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, supported by battleships and cruisers in a force designed to destroy American carriers and capture the island. Rochefort provides specific information on Japanese approach routes, timing of attacks, even the planned deception operation toward the Aleutian Islands, meant to draw American attention northward. Fletcher listens with the focused attention he brings to intelligence briefings, asking questions about confidence levels and alternative interpretations, needing to understand how much certainty underlies the intelligence before building tactical plans around it. The intelligence advantage provides Fletcher with the gift, carrier commanders dream about but rarely receive. Knowledge of enemy intentions, strength, and timing, with sufficient lead time to position forces for perfect ambush. Nimitz commits every available carrier to the operation, ordering Yorktown to sea despite incomplete repairs, and assigning both Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance's temporary command, while Halsey recuperates from illness. The force composition gives Fletcher 3 carriers, with approximately 234 aircraft against Nagumo's 4 carriers with 248 aircraft, numerical near parity that intelligence advantage might offset. Fletcher will command from Yorktown, operating independently while Spruance commands Enterprise and Hornet as a separate task group, all with the 2 forces coordinating by radio, while maintaining sufficient separation to prevent a single Japanese strike from hitting both groups simultaneously. Yorktown departs Pearl Harbor on May 27th, with repair crews still aboard, completing emergency patches, the carrier's wounds covered but not healed, her readiness questionable, but her presence essential. Fletcher watches the harbor fall astern, knowing that Yorktown should be in dry dock for another 2 months, but that operational necessity overrules peacetime maintenance standards. The destroyer screen forms around the carrier as she steams toward the rendezvous coordinates designated Point Luck, a location northeast of Midway, where American carriers will wait in ambush while Japanese forces approach from the northwest. The voyage to Point Luck proceeds without incident, Yorktown's crew working around the clock to complete repairs, while the carrier steams toward battle that will test whether emergency work suffices for combat operations. The rendezvous at Point Luck on May 28th brings Fletcher's Yorktown together with Spruance's Enterprise and Hornet, the 3 carriers that constitute America's entire available striking power in the Central Pacific. Fletcher establishes command relationships that reflect his methodical understanding of carrier operations. Spruance commands his 2-carrier task group with full tactical autonomy, coordinating with Fletcher by radio, but making independent decisions about timing and target selection. The arrangement recognizes that carrier warfare's speed and complexity prevent centralized control of separated forces, or that task group commanders must react to developing situations without waiting for direction from overall commanders potentially hundreds of miles away. Fletcher briefs Spruance on the intelligence picture and basic plan, position carriers northeast of Midway, where Japanese scouts least expect them. Allow Midway's land-based aircraft to attack first and draw Japanese attention, then strike enemy carriers when their decks are crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The positioning Fletcher selects demonstrates sophistication that critics rarely acknowledge in assessing his tactical competence. He places the carrier task forces approximately 200 miles northeast of Midway, far enough from the island to avoid Japanese scouts searching near the obvious target, but close enough to launch strikes when opportunity appears. The position also keeps American carriers upwind of the expected Japanese approach route, providing tactical advantage for launching and recovering aircraft, while forcing Japanese pilots to fly into headwinds during their return flights. Fletcher calculates that Japanese reconnaissance will focus on sectors near Midway and to the south, where logic suggests American carriers might approach, leaving the northeast sector less thoroughly searched. The positioning reflects months of studying how carriers operate and how commanders think, creating advantage through understanding enemy expectations rather than through superior force or technology. The waiting period from May 29th through June 3rd tests Fletcher's patience and his task force's readiness as the carriers steam slowly northeast of Midway, while radio intelligence tracks the Japanese approach. Fletcher maintains strict radio silence to avoid revealing American presence, communicating with Pearl Harbor through coded messages relayed by submarines. The intelligence updates confirm Rochefort's analysis. Japanese carriers are approaching on schedule, the main invasion force following behind the carrier striking force, everything proceeding according to the plan. American codebreakers penetrated. Fletcher uses the waiting time to review contingency plans with his staff, wargaming scenarios where intelligence proves wrong or Japanese forces deviate from predicted movements. The preparations reflect his characteristic thoroughness, planning for failure modes rather than assuming success, identifying what could go wrong before circumstances force improvisation under fire. The Japanese approach Midway confident they have achieved complete surprise. Admiral Nagumo believing American carriers remain in the South Pacific or undergoing repairs at Pearl Harbor. Japanese planning assumes the Midway operation will draw out whatever American forces can respond, allowing the superior Japanese carrier force to destroy them in decisive battle. Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represent the strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor, crews, and aircraft, with 6 months of combat experience against American forces still learning carrier warfare's basics. The Japanese numerical advantage seems modest, but their experience and training create qualitative superiority that should compensate for Fletcher's intelligence advantage. Nagumo steams toward Midway, expecting easy victory against an island garrison and possible engagement with 1 or 2 American carriers, completely unaware that 3 American carriers wait in ambush at Point Luck. The night of June 3rd brings final preparations as PBY patrol aircraft from Midway site, the Japanese invasion force approaching from the west. Fletcher receives the sighting report, confirming that Japanese forces are moving according to prediction, that Rochefort's intelligence has proven accurate, that the ambush is positioned correctly for the battle that will begin at dawn. He reviews the plan one final time with his staff, maintain position northeast of Midway, launch searches at first light to locate Japanese carriers, attack when targets appear while preserving sufficient aircraft for defensive combat air patrol. The plan reflects Fletcher's evolution as a carrier commander, balancing the aggressive action his superiors demand against the preservation instincts his training and experience reinforce. Tomorrow will determine whether intelligence advantage and careful positioning can overcome Japanese numerical and experiential superiority, whether Fletcher's methodical approach produces the decisive victory that has eluded him at Coral Sea. The tactical situation on the eve of Midway represents the clearest test of Fletcher's carrier warfare doctrine that the war has yet provided. He possesses intelligence superior to any commander in naval history, knowing enemy composition, timing, and intentions with precision that eliminates most uncertainty. His positioning is textbook perfect, placing American carriers where they can strike while remaining undetected until the critical moment. His force composition, while numerically inferior to Japanese strength, reflects everything America can commit to this battle. The variables Fletcher cannot control include pilot experience, aircraft reliability, and the 1,000 accidents that determine whether perfect planning produces perfect execution. His reputation, damaged by Coral Sea's mixed results and King's persistent criticism, will be restored or destroyed by decisions made in the next 48 hours. The tactical choices that must balance aggression against preservation while achieving the decisive victory that America desperately needs and that Fletcher's career requires. The strategic implications of Midway extend far beyond Fletcher's personal reputation to encompass the entire Pacific War's trajectory. Losing this battle would give Japan control of the Central Pacific, threatening Hawaii and forcing America into defensive operations that might last years. Winning decisively would shift the balance toward America, crippling Japanese carrier power and creating opportunities for offensive operations that could shorten the war. Fletcher carries responsibility for this outcome, despite commanding only a portion of American forces committed to Midway's defense. The island garrison, the submarines, the land-based aircraft all contribute to the battle, but carrier striking power will determine whether America wins or loses the engagement that may decide the Pacific War. The weight of responsibility combines with the opportunity intelligence provides to create a moment where Fletcher's careful planning and tactical competence will finally receive the test that could vindicate his entire approach to carrier warfare, or confirm critics' assessment that caution has replaced aggression in ways that prevent decisive victory. Dawn breaks over the Pacific Ocean northeast of Midway on June 4, 1942, with Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher ordering search aircraft launched into skies that will soon witness the most consequential carrier battle in naval history. Yorktown scouts lift off at 4:30 hours, fanning out to search the northwest sectors, where intelligence predicts Japanese carriers will appear. Fletcher maintains his task force 200 miles northeast of Midway, holding position while waiting for confirmation of enemy location before committing to attack. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, steams 30 miles south of Fletcher. The two American task groups separated sufficiently that a single Japanese strike cannot hit both, but close enough for mutual support, if circumstances require. The separation reflects Fletcher's tactical doctrine of distributing risk across separated forces, rather than concentrating all carriers where one successful enemy attack could cripple American striking power entirely. The first contact report arrives at 5:34 hours from a Midway-based PBY patrol aircraft, citing Japanese carriers northwest of the island, approximately 200 miles from Fletcher's position. The report provides bearing and rough composition, but lacks the precise coordinates Fletcher needs before launching strikes into empty ocean, searching for targets that might have changed position. He orders Yorktown to continue searching while monitoring the situation, waiting for updated information before committing his attack aircraft. Spruance faces a different calculus, commanding two carriers whose attack aircraft could launch immediately. He can strike now based on imprecise coordinates and arrive as Japanese carriers recover aircraft from their Midway strike, or wait for better information and arrive after Japanese carriers have relaunched their air groups with improved defensive posture. Spruance chooses aggression over precision, ordering Enterprise and Hornet to launch full strikes at 607 hours based on the PBY's sighting report. Fletcher receives updated contact information at 630 hours, confirming Japanese carrier locations with sufficient precision to justify launching Yorktown's strike. He orders attack aircraft spotted and launched by 700 hours. Yorktown squadrons forming up, while Enterprise and Hornet aircraft already fly northwest toward their targets. The staggered launch timing that results from Fletcher's caution will prove tactically significant despite appearing to reflect hesitation. Yorktown's aircraft will arrive at Japanese carriers 30 minutes after Enterprise and Hornet squadrons, creating a second wave that catches Japanese defenses reorganizing from the first attack. The timing emerges from Fletcher's careful verification of target locations, rather than coordinated planning, but the effect will be devastating, regardless of whether Fletcher intended the tactical benefit his methodical approach produces. The American strikes converge on Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers between 9:20 and 10:30 hours, finding the Japanese force in the worst possible state for defending against air attack. Nagumo has launched strikes against Midway Island at dawn, and those aircraft are returning for rearmament and refueling, while mechanics crowd the flight decks. Ordnance handlers move bombs and torpedoes for rearming operations. Fuel lines pump aviation gasoline into thirsty aircraft. Nagumo knows American carriers operate somewhere nearby. His scouts spotted them shortly after Fletcher's scouts found Japanese carriers. But he believes he has time to recover his Midway strike force, rearm them for anti-ship operations, then launch coordinated attacks against American carriers. The assumption proves catastrophically wrong as American aircraft appear overhead, while Japanese flight decks remain crowded with aircraft being serviced. The torpedo squadron attacks that precede the dive bomber strikes create the conditions for American victory through sacrifice that approaches the suicidal. Oye Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacks first at 9:20 hours, 15 TBD. Devastator torpedo bombers approaching at wavetop level, while Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire tear them apart with methodical efficiency. All 15 aircraft fall into the ocean, shot down before launching torpedoes that might damage Japanese carriers, only Ensign George Gay surviving to watch the battle from the water. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacks next, with identical results, 14 aircraft launching with 10 shot down, and no hits achieved on Japanese carriers that maneuver violently while fighters strafe the slow-moving torpedo bombers. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown completes the disaster at 1000 hours. The 12 aircraft attacking with 10 destroyed, and again, no torpedo hits scored against targets that seem invincible behind defensive fire and fighter protection. The annihilation of the torpedo squadrons appears to confirm Japanese superiority and American incompetence. 41 torpedo bombers launched with 35 destroyed and 0 hits achieved, losses approaching 90% for no damage inflicted. The attacks seem wasted, sacrifices thrown away against defenses too strong for obsolete aircraft and inadequately trained pilots to penetrate. But the torpedo attacks accomplish something invisible to observers watching aircraft fall burning into the ocean. They pull Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, drawing fighters away from high altitude where they could intercept dive bombers, all forcing Japanese carriers to maneuver violently and disrupting rearming operations. The sacrifice creates an opening that dive bombers will exploit, though no one plans this coordination. And most torpedo squadron crews die without knowing their attacks served any purpose beyond drawing fire. The dive bomber attacks strike between 10, 22, and 10:25 hours, with timing so perfect it seems planned rather than the result of navigational luck, and Fletcher's staggered launch schedule. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise dive bombers, arrives first at 10:22, spotting Japanese carriers below with no high-altitude fighter protection. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed, perfect targets for the plunging attack dive bombers execute best. McCluskey's squadron split between carriers Keiga and Akagi, all pushing over into 70-degree dives from 14,000 feet, while anti-aircraft fire creates black clouds that pilots must fly through to reach release altitude. Bombs fall toward targets that cannot maneuver fast enough to evade, explosions tearing through flight decks into hangar bays, where armed aircraft await launch, fuel, and ordnance, creating secondary explosions that transform both carriers into burning wrecks within minutes. Yorktown's dive bombers arrive at 10:25 hours, 30 minutes after Enterprise aircraft, per Fletcher's delayed launch decision, finding Japanese carrier Soryu attempting to launch aircraft, while Kaga and Akagi burn nearby. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron attacks Soryu with the same devastating precision Enterprise squadrons brought to Kaga and Akagi, or 3 bomb hits in rapid successions, penetrating flight deck and starting fires that will doom the carrier. The timing creates a second strike wave that Japanese defenses cannot handle while still reeling from the first attack. Fletcher's caution producing tactical benefit through accidental coordination rather than planned timing. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Keiga, and Soryu, burn out of control, their flight decks wrecked, their aircraft destroyed, their crews abandoning ship or fighting fires they cannot extinguish. The battle that should have destroyed American carriers has instead crippled Japanese carrier power in the time required to fly 1 dive bombing attack. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, escapes the initial American strikes, all operating separately from Nagumo's other 3 carriers, and launching counterattacks that will test whether Fletcher's victory is complete or merely temporary. Hiryu's aircraft locate and attack Yorktown between noon and 2:30 hours, scoring bomb and torpedo hits that damage Fletcher's flagship and eventually force him to transfer command to a cruiser. The Japanese counterstrike demonstrates that the battle remains dangerous despite the morning's success, that carrier warfare's exchange nature means accepting casualties while inflicting them, that Fletcher's careful planning cannot prevent losses when both sides launch strikes simultaneously. But Hiryu's attacks cannot change the fundamental outcome. 3 Japanese carriers already destroyed. American carrier, strength damaged but intact. And the balance shifted decisively toward America in the 5 minutes between 10:22 and 10:27 hours on June 4th, 1942. The immediate aftermath finds Fletcher assessing victory incomplete. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed, but 1 remaining operational. Yorktown, damaged and possibly sinking. The battle not yet finished despite decisive advantage achieved. His characteristic focus on what remains undone, rather than celebrating success already accomplished, reflects the tactical caution that critics see as excessive, but that prevents declaring victory while threats remain. Enterprise will locate and destroy Hiryu late afternoon, completing the destruction of Nagumo's carrier force. But Fletcher's role in the battle effectively ends when Yorktown's damage forces him off his flagship. The command relationship he established with Spruance allows the battle to continue without Fletcher's direct control, Spruance pursuing the final Japanese carrier, while Fletcher transfers to cruiser Astoria and watches his carefully prepared ambush achieve results that exceed even optimistic projections. The 5 minutes that change the war vindicate Fletcher's positioning and timing, while demonstrating that carrier warfare's violence and speed produce outcomes that planning can enable but never fully control. The Japanese counterstrike from carrier Hiryu materializes at noon on June 4, 1942, 18 Aichi dive bombers appearing in clear skies above Task Force 17, while Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher maneuvers Yorktown to defend against attack he knew must come. The carrier's radar picks up incoming aircraft at approximately 46 miles, providing warning that allows combat air patrol fighters to intercept before bombers reach attack positions. Wildcat fighters tear into the Japanese formation, shooting down multiple aircraft and disrupting attack coordination, but sufficient bombers penetrate the defensive screen to threaten Yorktown with the kind of damage that ended Lexington's life at Coral Sea. Fletcher watches the attack develop from his flag bridge, understanding that his flagship has become the target Japanese pilots seek because 3 of their 4 carriers already burn following the morning's American strikes. The dive bombers push over at 1200 hours, plunging toward Yorktown in attacks that combine desperation with professional skill. The Japanese pilots, knowing their carriers burn behind them, while pressing attacks through anti-aircraft fire that fills the sky with exploding shells. 3 bombs hit Yorktown in rapid succession, despite the carrier's violent maneuvering and intense defensive fire. The first bomb penetrates to the 4th deck before exploding, killing or wounding dozens and starting fires in spaces deep within the ship. The second bomb hits near the funnel, disrupting boiler uptakes and reducing speed. The third bomb strikes the flight deck, creating a massive hole and starting fires that threaten to spread throughout the ship. The carrier slows, black smoke pouring from multiple locations, damage that would sink less well-designed ships or kill less well-trained crews. The damage control response demonstrates lessons Fletcher's crews learned at Coral Sea when Lexington died from explosions that damage control parties could not reach or suppress. Yorktown's damage control teams attack fires with equipment and procedures refined through training and bitter experience, understanding that carrier survival depends on containing damage before it spreads beyond control. Engineers restore partial power to damaged boilers within 90 minutes, returning speed to approximately 19 knots, despite bomb damage that initially killed all power. Flight deck crews patch the hole sufficiently to allow aircraft recovery, demonstrating the resilience that American carrier design builds into ships expected to absorb damage and continue fighting. By 1400 hours, Yorktown appears crippled, but recovering, steaming slowly while damage control makes progress toward restoring full combat capability. The second Japanese strike arrives at 1430 hours, torpedo bombers from Hiryu attacking a carrier already damaged and struggling to maintain speed. Fletcher's staff has restored some defensive capability, combat air patrol fighters engaging Japanese aircraft, while anti-aircraft guns fire at targets approaching from multiple angles. The torpedo attack presses through defensive fire with the same determination the dive bombers showed, Japanese pilots knowing they have no carriers to return to if they survive, launching torpedoes at a damaged carrier that cannot maneuver effectively to evade. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown's port side in rapid succession, in underwater explosions tearing into hull and flooding compartments that engineers had kept dry despite the bomb damage. The carrier loses all power, lists 26 degrees to port, and begins the slow process of dying that Captain Elliot Buckmaster must now manage. The decision to abandon ship comes at 1500 hours when Buckmaster assesses that Yorktown cannot be saved, that the list continues increasing despite counter-flooding efforts, that loss of power prevents damage control from operating pumps and firefighting equipment. Fletcher agrees with the assessment, having transferred his flag to cruiser Astoria shortly before the torpedo attack killed Yorktown's power. The abandonment proceeds with discipline that reflects American naval training and professionalism. Our crew members going over the side in orderly groups while destroyers approach to rescue survivors. Fletcher watches from Astoria as his flagship settles lower in the water, listing badly but refusing to sink immediately, the carrier demonstrating the toughness that American shipbuilding brings to vessels designed to absorb punishment and survive when possible. The transfer of tactical command to Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, occurs smoothly despite the chaos of battle and Fletcher's evacuation from his sinking flagship. Fletcher established command relationships before the battle that allow Spruance to operate independently, understanding that carrier warfare's speed prevents centralized control when task groups operate separately. Spruance assumes overall tactical command without hesitation, all continuing operations against the Japanese force, while Fletcher coordinates rescue operations and assesses whether Yorktown might be salvaged despite her damage. The transition demonstrates Fletcher's organizational competence, establishing systems that function during crisis rather than requiring constant personal intervention. But the optics of Fletcher leaving his flagship during battle create perception problems that careful planning cannot prevent. He appears to abandon command at the critical moment despite following proper procedure, and ensuring tactical control passes smoothly to a fully capable subordinate. The destruction of Hiryu, late afternoon, completes the American victory at Midway. An Enterprise dive bombers locating and attacking the last operational Japanese carrier with the same devastating precision that destroyed 3 carriers that morning. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sink or burn beyond saving. Admiral Nagumo's force that attacked Pearl Harbor, effectively destroyed by American carriers that 6 months earlier seemed hopelessly outmatched. Fletcher receives reports of Hiryu's destruction while coordinating Yorktown rescue operations, understanding that the battle has achieved decisive American victory despite his flagship's loss. The strategic implications become clear even while the battle continues. Japan has lost the core of its carrier striking power, while America retains 3 damaged but operational carriers. The balance shifted decisively despite Yorktown's probable loss. The salvage attempt for Yorktown begins June 5th when tugs reach the drifting carrier and begin towing toward Pearl Harbor, damage control parties returning aboard to assess whether the ship can be saved. The carrier remains afloat 36 hours after the torpedo attack, her list stabilized and fires extinguished, suggesting that American damage control and ship design might preserve a carrier that Japanese damage would have destroyed. Salvage crews worked through June 5th and into June 6th, making progress towards saving a ship whose loss would reduce American carrier strength to 2 operational flat ops. Then, at dawn on June 6th, Japanese submarine Mabaashka 168 penetrates the destroyer screen and launches torpedoes at both Yorktown and destroyer Hammond, alongside providing power for pumps. The torpedoes hit both ships, thus breaking Hammond in half and sinking her within minutes while delivering the death blow to Yorktown that bomb and torpedo damage 2 days earlier failed to achieve. Yorktown sinks at dawn on June 7, 1942, the carrier slipping beneath the Pacific, carrying with her the flagship from which Fletcher commanded at Coral Sea and Midway, the platform from which he directed the battles that stopped Japanese expansion and shifted the Pacific War's momentum toward America. Fletcher receives word of Yorktown's final loss while steaming toward Pearl Harbor aboard Astoria, understanding that the carrier's death removes any possibility of claiming perfect victory. The statistical balance shows 4 Japanese carriers destroyed against 1 American carrier lost, a ratio that represents decisive victory by any objective measure. But Fletcher knows that institutional Navy measures success differently, that losing your flagship during battle creates perception problems regardless of tactical competence, that King and other critics will find fault even in victory because Fletcher failed to achieve perfect results without casualties. The human cost of Midway emerges in casualty reports that Fletcher reviews during the return voyage to Pearl Harbor. The torpedo squadron suffered nearly total losses. 35 of 41 aircraft destroyed, most pilots killed before they could parachute from burning planes or escape sinking aircraft. Yorktown lost 141 men killed during the battle and subsequent salvage operations, sailors and airmen who died turning desperate defense into decisive victory. Hammond's sinking killed 80 additional sailors, all men providing support to Yorktown salvage when the submarine attack sent their destroyer to the bottom in minutes. The price of victory includes these dead and wounded alongside the material losses, human costs that Fletcher acknowledges in official reports without the emotional language that might make casualties seem more real to readers scanning battle summaries for strategic significance. The immediate aftermath of Midway leaves Fletcher commanding a task force steaming toward Pearl Harbor with victory achieved, but questions hanging over his performance despite results that exceed any reasonable expectations. He positioned the carriers perfectly, timed the searches correctly, maintained tactical control through his flagship's crippling, transferred command smoothly when circumstances required, and achieved the decisive victory that America desperately needed. But he lost Yorktown, transferred his flag during battle, watched from a cruiser while Spruance commanded the final strikes against Hiryu. The contradiction between objective success and subjective perception, between results achieved and image projected, creates the conditions for assessments that will praise Fletcher's victory while questioning whether a different commander might have accomplished more at lower cost. The battle that should establish Fletcher's reputation instead creates new opportunities for critics to find fault even in victory, demonstrating that perception often matters more than performance in determining which commanders receive recognition and which fade into obscurity despite achievements that speak for themselves. The first press accounts of Midway reach American newspapers on June 7, 1942, stories that transform a desperate defensive battle into triumphant victory, but distribute credit in ways that minimize Fletcher's role despite his overall tactical command. Admiral Chester Nimitz's press release emphasizes the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers while carefully avoiding details about command relationships or which admirals made which decisions. Reporters focus on dramatic elements, the sacrifice of torpedo squadrons, the 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks that destroyed 3 carriers, the heroism of pilots flying against superior odds. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's name appears occasionally in these accounts, usually in passive constructions, noting that he commanded the overall force. But the narrative focuses on aggressive action and individual heroism rather than the careful positioning and methodical planning that created conditions for victory. The Time magazine coverage that reaches newsstands in mid-June establishes a narrative that will persist for decades, despite contradicting the actual command structure at Midway. The magazine's battle account emphasizes Admiral Raymond Spruance's aggressive action in launching Enterprise and Hornet strikes at the earliest possible moment, contrasting this bold decision against unnamed caution from higher command levels. Fletcher appears in the account primarily as the admiral who transferred command when his flagship suffered damage, language that suggests abandoning responsibility rather than following proper procedure. The article never explicitly criticizes Fletcher, but the emphasis on Spruance's aggression and the passive description of Fletcher's actions creates clear implication that bolder leadership produced victory, despite rather than because of overall tactical command decisions. Readers absorb the message that Spruance won Midway through decisive action, while Fletcher played a secondary role despite his official position as tactical commander. The classified assessments circulating through Navy channels reveal more nuanced, but still critical evaluation of Fletcher's Midway performance. Admiral Ernest King writes to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox on June 15th that Midway represents a great American victory achieved through superior intelligence, pilot courage, and tactical execution at squadron level. King's assessment mentions Fletcher's overall command only briefly, in noting that the victory occurred despite rather than because of overly cautious launch decisions that delayed Yorktown's strike force relative to Enterprise and Hornet squadrons. King argues that bolder action on Fletcher's part could have destroyed all 4 Japanese carriers in the morning strike, preventing Hiryu from launching the counterattack that damaged Yorktown. The assessment ignores that Fletcher's delayed launch created the second wave that caught Japanese defenses reorganizing from the first attack. That timing, which appeared cautious, actually produced tactical benefit. That perfect coordination resulted from careful verification rather than aggressive gambling. Eddie Nimitz's recommendation for Fletcher's decoration reveals the uncomfortable political position occupied by the Pacific Fleet commander, defending a subordinate whose results satisfy tactical requirements without inspiring confidence in Washington. Nimitz submits Fletcher's name for the Distinguished Service Medal, a significant decoration, but notably not the Medal of Honor, awarded to several Midway pilots who attacked Japanese carriers at wavetop level. The recommendation cites Fletcher's positioning of carrier forces, coordination of searches, and tactical command through difficult circumstances. Nimitz's private correspondence shows more complicated feelings. He writes to King that Fletcher performed competently at Midway, but that younger, more aggressive commanders might better suit future offensive operations. The assessment damns Fletcher with measured praise, acknowledging success while questioning whether his cautious style fits the aggressive warfare America must wage to defeat Japan. The institutional Navy's narrative construction around Midway reveals how personalities and politics shape historical memory as powerfully as actual battle results. Spruance becomes the hero of Midway, despite commanding as Fletcher's subordinate, his decision to launch early receiving credit as bold action rather than aggressive gambling that could have failed if Japanese carriers had been located incorrectly. The dive bomber pilots who destroyed 3 carriers in 5 minutes receive well-deserved recognition for skill and courage under fire. The torpedo squadron pilots who died attacking Japanese carriers become martyred heroes whose sacrifice enabled victory. Fletcher, the overall tactical commander, who positioned forces perfectly and coordinated the battle successfully, appears in these narratives as competent but uninspiring, a staff officer rather than a warrior, someone who did his job without demonstrating the aggressive spirit that American victories require. The contrast between Fletcher's actual role and his perceived contribution demonstrates how institutional bias toward bold personalities creates mythology that diverges from documentary evidence. The strategic situation following Midway appears to vindicate aggressive carrier operations, despite the losses such operations produce, creating pressure for commanders who match King's vision of naval warfare. And America has lost Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway, reducing carrier strength to 2 operational flat ops, with Saratoga still under repair and new construction months away from commissioning. But Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway plus Shoho at Coral Sea, suffering damage to Shokaku and Zuikaku's air groups that keeps both carriers out of action for months. The exchange ratio favors America dramatically, despite absolute losses, suggesting that aggressive action accepting casualties produces better results than careful preservation. King reads the Coral Sea and Midway results as confirmation that bold commanders willing to take risks achieve victories that cautious admirals cannot match, reinforcing his preference for Halsey-style aggression over Fletcher-style careful calculation. The command assignment Fletcher receives in July 1942 appears superficially as a promotion, but actually represents an impossible task designed to test whether he can operate more aggressively under direct pressure. King and Nimitz assign Fletcher command of all carrier forces in the South Pacific for Operation Watchtower, the amphibious invasion of Guadalcanal that will mark America's first offensive ground operation against Japanese-held territory. Fletcher will be responsible for supporting the Marine landings, maintaining air cover over the beachhead, protecting the invasion fleet, and engaging Japanese naval forces attempting to disrupt the operation. The assignment requires operating carriers in confined waters within range of Japanese land-based bombers from Rabaul to exactly the situation Fletcher has spent months arguing represents unacceptable risk. His protests that carrier forces cannot operate indefinitely in such constrained positions receive the response that Guadalcanal requires aggressive action, regardless of risk, that America cannot remain on the defensive indefinitely, that Fletcher must accomplish the mission or face replacement. The growing tension between Fletcher and his superiors reflects fundamentally incompatible philosophies about carrier employment and acceptable casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. Fletcher believes carriers remain too valuable and too scarce to risk in operations where land-based air power enjoys numerical superiority. That preserving carrier strength for future battles serves American strategy better than accepting losses to accomplish immediate objectives. King and other aggressive commanders argue that carriers exist to fight, that avoiding risk means surrendering initiative to Japan, that America must accept carrier losses as the price of offensive action. Neither position is entirely wrong. Fletcher's caution makes sense when America possesses only 2 or 3 operational carriers. King's aggression reflects strategic necessity of maintaining offensive pressure on Japan. But the philosophical divide creates political conflict that Fletcher's quiet personality cannot resolve through persuasion or personal appeal. The press coverage and official assessments following Midway establish a narrative that Fletcher will never successfully challenge or correct. Despite commanding the battle that broke Japanese carrier power and changed the Pacific War's strategic direction, despite positioning forces perfectly and coordinating successful operations despite his flagship's crippling, Fletcher receives minimal credit for a victory that should have established his reputation permanently. Spruance emerges as Midway's hero, a narrative Spruance himself never encourages, but that serves institutional Navy preference for aggressive commanders over methodical planners. The torpedo squadron pilots receive deserved recognition for courage under fire. Fletcher becomes a footnote in his own greatest victory. The admiral who transferred command and watched from a cruiser while others completed the battle, he carefully prepared and successfully initiated. The hollow quality of victory achieved, but unrecognized, of success dismissed, because it lacks the dramatic qualities that create compelling narratives, defines Fletcher's experience at Midway, and foreshadows the reputation problems that will destroy his carrier command career, despite an operational record that few admirals in any navy have matched. The personal impact on Fletcher emerges in correspondence with family and friends written during the weeks following Midway. Letters that reveal a man aware of his reputation problems, but unwilling or unable to engage in the self-promotion that might correct false narratives. He writes to his wife that the battle went well, and the strategic objective was achieved, matter-of-fact language that fails to convey the magnitude of victory or his personal role in accomplishing it. He notes in a letter to a Naval Academy classmate that press coverage seems focused on personalities rather than tactical competence, observing without bitterness that institutional Navy values appearance over substance in ways that disadvantage quiet professionals. The letters show Fletcher understanding his predicament without knowing how to solve it, recognizing that he operates in a military culture where reputation matters as much as results, but lacking the skills or inclination to manage his image effectively. The pattern will continue through the Guadalcanal campaign, where Fletcher's final carrier command will end not with obvious failure, but with relief that appears justified by circumstance, while actually reflecting King's determination to replace methodical competence with aggressive boldness, regardless of actual combat effectiveness. The conference room at Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor witnesses a contentious meeting on July 10, 1942, as Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher confronts the reality of Operation Watchtower, the planned invasion of Guadalcanal that will thrust American forces into offensive ground combat for the first time in the Pacific War. Sidney Fletcher sits across from Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, and Major General Alexander Vandegrift, leading the 1st Marine Division, the 3 men responsible for executing an operation that everyone present understands has been planned inadequately and resourced insufficiently. Turner insists that carrier air cover must remain over Guadalcanal for at least 5 days to allow complete unloading of transports and establishment of defensive positions ashore. Fletcher argues that keeping carriers in confined waters within range of Rabal's land-based bombers for 5 days represents unacceptable risk, that Japanese air superiority in the region makes carrier preservation impossible if the carriers remain stationary, supporting amphibious operations. The argument grows heated as Turner accuses Fletcher of excessive caution, while Fletcher counters that Turner's amphibious planning ignores tactical realities of carrier warfare in enemy-controlled waters. The strategic context for Guadalcanal makes the operation simultaneously necessary and nearly impossible given available resources. Japanese forces are building an airfield on Guadalcanal that will threaten Allied supply lines to Australia if allowed to become operational. Stopping the airfield construction requires capturing the island before the base becomes functional, forcing America into offensive operations before adequate preparation or resource accumulation. The invasion force includes only 2 Marine regiments totaling approximately 16,000 men, supported by 3 carriers and limited naval gunfire support, attacking an island whose Japanese strength remains uncertain. Intelligence estimates Japanese garrison at approximately 3,000 troops, but these estimates prove optimistic regarding both numbers and quality of forces defending Guadalcanal. Fletcher receives orders to support the landing with carrier aircraft while protecting against Japanese naval counterattacks, maintaining impossible balance between stationary support operations and mobile defensive positioning. The planning for Operation Watchtower proceeds through July, with growing recognition that the operation has earned its nickname, shoestring, through genuine resource limitations rather than excessive caution. The Navy can commit only 3 carriers, Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp, operating hundreds of miles from secure bases with limited logistics support. The Marine Division loaded for the invasion discovers that inadequate shipping means leaving substantial equipment and supplies behind, accepting risk that reinforcement and resupply may prove difficult if Japanese forces respond more quickly than planners assume. Fletcher attends planning conferences where Turner's amphibious staff presents timelines assuming Japanese forces will need days to organize counterattacks, allowing leisurely unloading of supplies and establishment of defensive positions ashore. Fletcher challenges these assumptions based on 6 months' experience, fighting Japanese forces who respond to American actions with speed and aggression that peacetime planning exercises never anticipated. Fletcher's written objections to the Guadalcanal operation, submitted to Nimitz on July 26th, as to articulate concerns that will prove prophetic, but that mark him as insufficiently aggressive in King's assessment. Fletcher argues that operating carriers in the waters northeast of Guadalcanal, confined by surrounding islands and within 600 miles of Rabaul's estimated 100 bombers, violates every principle of carrier employment that 6 months of warfare has established. He notes that carriers require sea room for maneuvering during air attacks, that confined waters restrict evasive action, and increase vulnerability to both air attack and submarine threat. His calculation shows that maintaining air cover over Guadalcanal for 5 days requires carriers to operate in essentially stationary positions, refueling and recovery operations limiting mobility during exactly the period when Japanese counterattacks will develop. The objections receive acknowledgement, but no modification to plans. Guadalcanal must be captured regardless of risk. Fletcher must support the operation despite his professional judgment that carrier losses will result. The strategic situation overrides tactical caution. The invasion force departs Fiji on July 31st, converging on Guadalcanal for landing scheduled August 7th, Fletcher commanding the carrier groups, while Turner leads the amphibious forces, and Vandegrift prepares the Marines for their first opposed landing of the Pacific War. The approach proceeds without detection, weather, and luck concealing the American force until the last moment, achieving surprise that should allow unopposed landings. Fletcher maintains his carriers southeast of Guadalcanal. It's launching airstrikes before dawn on August 7th to suppress Japanese resistance before the Marines hit the beaches. The airstrikes achieve complete surprise. Japanese garrison caught unprepared as American dive bombers and fighters strafe positions around the airfield while Marines storm ashore against minimal initial resistance. The landing succeeds beyond optimistic expectations. Marines secure the beachhead, capture the partially completed airfield, establish defensive perimeter with minimal casualties. The operational success appears to vindicate the shoestring planning, American forces achieving objectives that careful preparation seemed to require luck and Japanese mistakes to accomplish. The situation deteriorates rapidly on August 8th, as Japanese forces at Rabaul respond to the Guadalcanal invasion with exactly the speed and strength that Fletcher feared. 27 Mitsubishi Betty bombers, escorted by fighters, launched from Rabaul at midday, flying the 600 miles to Guadalcanal to attack the American carriers. Turner insisted must remain, supporting the beachhead. Fletcher's combat air patrol engages the Japanese attack force, shooting down multiple bombers but failing to prevent determined attackers from reaching the carriers. The attack achieves minimal success, no carriers hit, several Japanese aircraft destroyed, but demonstrates that Fletcher's fears about operating within range of land-based bombers were entirely justified. The combat air patrol required to defend against these attacks depletes fighter strength, aircraft landing to refuel and rearm, while subsequent Japanese strikes could penetrate defensive screens. Fletcher faces exactly the situation he spent months trying to avoid. Carriers exposed to superior land-based air power, while tied to supporting amphibious operations that limit their mobility. The unloading situation ashore compounds Fletcher's concerns, as Turner's amphibious forces struggle to meet the optimistic timeline that planners assumed would allow 5 days of uninterrupted operations. Cargo ships and transports offload supplies slower than expected, Marines working to establish positions, while also unloading equipment. Dock facilities inadequate for the volume of material requiring movement from ships to shore. By evening of August 8th, Turner's forces have unloaded only approximately 60% of supplies intended for the Marines, achieving less than hoped after 2 days of what Fletcher agreed would be maximum 3 days of carrier support. Turner requests that Fletcher extend carrier operations an additional 2 days to allow completion of unloading, arguing that Marines cannot defend Guadalcanal adequately without the supplies still aboard ships. Fletcher faces the decision that will define his Guadalcanal command: extend carrier operations in waters he considers untenable, or withdraw on schedule and leave Marines potentially undersupplied on a hostile island. The decision Fletcher announces on evening of August 8th represents the culmination of 6 months' philosophical conflict between preservation and employment of irreplaceable carrier forces. He informs Turner that the carriers will withdraw the following morning, completing 3 days of support operations as originally agreed, but refusing to extend further into risk he considers unacceptable. Fletcher's reasoning reflects his consistent operational philosophy. Carriers have defended against multiple Japanese air attacks. Fuel states in screening destroyers approach minimums for safe operations. Intelligence suggests larger Japanese naval forces approaching Guadalcanal for night surface engagement. Remaining in confined waters with deteriorating fuel states and increasing Japanese pressure violates every principle Fletcher believes essential for carrier preservation. Turner protests that Marines will be left without adequate supplies, that withdrawal represents abandonment of forces ashore, that Fletcher prioritizes carrier safety over mission accomplishment. Fletcher acknowledges the concerns but maintains his decision. The carriers withdraw on August 9th. The timing of Fletcher's withdrawal proves tragically unfortunate when Japanese naval forces attack the amphibious shipping off Guadalcanal on night of August 8th to 9th in what becomes known as the Battle of Savo Island. Japanese cruisers penetrate the American screening forces after midnight. It is sinking 3 American heavy cruisers and 1 Australian cruiser in 30 minutes of devastating night surface combat. Turner loses nearly 1,000 sailors, killed in the worst defeat the United States Navy suffers in a surface engagement during the entire war. Fletcher's carriers are not involved in Savo Island. The battle occurs at night, when carrier aircraft cannot operate effectively. But the timing creates perception that his withdrawal contributed to the disaster, even though his carriers could not have prevented Japanese cruisers from executing a night attack. The withdrawal decision becomes linked with Savo Island in ways that damage Fletcher's reputation, despite the battles having no tactical connection. The critics arguing that bolder command presence might have deterred Japanese attack, even if carrier aircraft couldn't participate in night combat. The aftermath of the Guadalcanal landings leaves Marines established ashore but undersupplied, the amphibious force decimated at Savo Island, and Fletcher steaming southeast with carriers he preserved at cost of appearing to abandon the invasion force. The strategic situation continues favoring America. Marines hold Henderson Field and will soon make it operational, providing land-based air power that partially substitutes for carrier support. Fletcher withdrew. But the operational execution appears flawed. Ships lost to Japanese night attack, supplies unloaded incompletely. Perceptions that excessive carrier caution prevented fuller support of critical offensive operation. Fletcher's decision to withdraw carriers after 3 days rather than 5 reflects his calculation that 3 days represented maximum acceptable risk given fuel states, Japanese air threat, and carrier vulnerability in confined waters. The calculation proves accurate in preserving carriers for future operations, but accuracy provides no political protection against criticism that he left Marines inadequately supported during their first major offensive of the Pacific War. The pattern established in earlier operations repeats at Guadalcanal. Fletcher achieves his objective of preserving carriers, while critics argue that bolder action might have achieved more at acceptable risk. Neither side entirely wrong, but institutional culture favoring aggressive action over careful calculation, regardless of actual results achieved. Radio intelligence reaches Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the carrier Saratoga on August 23, 1942, reporting a major Japanese naval force approaching Guadalcanal from the north with intent to reinforce the island garrison and challenge American control of the waters around Henderson Field. Fletcher orders his 3-carrier task force, Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp, to steam north from their patrol stations southeast of Guadalcanal, positioning to intercept the Japanese force that intelligence suggests includes at least 2 fleet carriers, plus supporting cruisers and destroyers. The intelligence proves accurate in its essentials, but incomplete in details. Japanese Admiral Nobutake Kondo, commanding a force built around carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. The same ships that fought at Coral Sea now return to combat after months of repair and air group reconstitution. Fletcher faces another carrier battle under circumstances that continue his impossible balancing act between aggressive engagement and force preservation, knowing that his performance at Eastern Solomons will be judged against rising criticism of his Guadalcanal withdrawal 2 weeks earlier. The tactical situation on August 24th develops into the kind of complex multi-layered operation that carrier warfare produces when both sides operate multiple task groups pursuing different objectives simultaneously. The Japanese force includes not just the main carrier striking group under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, but also a separate group built around light carrier Ryujo, escorting troop transports intended for Guadalcanal. Fletcher's searches locate Ryujo first, the light carrier operating approximately 200 miles north of the main Japanese force, presenting Fletcher with a dilemma that mirrors the false contact problem at Coral Sea. Ryujo appears to be bait designed to draw American strikes away from the main Japanese carriers, allowing Shokaku and Zuikaku to attack American carriers while their aircraft pursue a secondary target. Fletcher faces the choice between ignoring obvious bait and risking that Ryujo will strike Henderson Field unopposed, or attacking Ryujo and possibly being out of position when the main Japanese carriers appear. Fletcher's solution demonstrates evolution in his tactical thinking, a willingness to accept calculated risk that his earlier operations showed only hesitantly. He orders Saratoga to launch a full strike against Ryujo, while keeping Enterprise and Wasp air groups available for strikes against the main Japanese carriers when searches locate them. The decision splits his forces in ways that peacetime doctrine discouraged, committing one carrier's striking power to a secondary target while maintaining offensive capability against primary threats. The gamble reflects Fletcher's growing comfort with the kind of aggressive action his superiors demand, balancing preservation instincts against operational necessity in ways that earlier operations never quite achieved. Saratoga's strike launches at 1300 hours, at 38 aircraft heading north toward Ryujo, while Fletcher's other carriers maintain combat air patrol and ready strike forces for immediate launch against targets that searches continue seeking. The attack on Ryujo achieves complete success by 1400 hours. American dive bombers and torpedo planes overwhelming the light carrier's defenses with concentrated strikes that leave the ship burning and sinking. Ryujo takes 13 bomb hits and multiple torpedo hits, her light construction and minimal armor providing no protection against sustained assault. The carrier sinks with heavy loss of life, Japanese destroyers rescuing survivors while the American strike force returns towards Saratoga, having eliminated one Japanese carrier from the battle. As Fletcher receives strike reports confirming Ryujo's destruction, while also learning that his searches have finally located the main Japanese force, Shokaku and Zuikaku, operating northeast of Fletcher's position, approximately 200 miles distant, and launching their own strikes toward the American carriers even as Fletcher's pilots return from sinking Ryujo. The tactical situation becomes the simultaneous strike exchange that carrier warfare theory predicted, both sides launching attacks while knowing enemy aircraft fly toward their own carriers. The Japanese strike locates Enterprise at 1625 hours, 61 aircraft attacking the carrier with coordination and skill that reflects veteran Japanese air groups' experience and training. The Enterprise maneuvers violently while combat air patrol fighters engage Japanese bombers and torpedo planes, shooting down multiple attackers but failing to prevent determined pilots from pressing attacks through defensive fire. The carrier takes 3 bomb hits in rapid succession between 1644 and 1648 hours. Explosions tearing through flight deck and killing dozens, while starting fires that damage control parties must contain before they spread beyond control. Enterprise's crew fights their ship with the efficiency that American damage control training produces, containing fires and maintaining speed despite damage that would cripple less well-designed carriers. The ship remains operational, continuing to launch and recover aircraft, while engineers work to repair battle damage that could have proven fatal without skilled damage control response. Fletcher watches Enterprise absorb punishment, while his own Saratoga operates nearby, so far undetected by Japanese strikes that focused on Enterprise as the more visible target. The exchange produces results that validate Fletcher's decision to split forces. Ryujo sunk, Enterprise damaged but operational. Shokaku and Zuikaku untouched by American strikes that never located the main Japanese carriers in time to attack before they launched their own strikes. The battle demonstrates both the successes and limitations of Fletcher's evolving tactical doctrine. It's showing willingness to take calculated risks while also revealing that carrier warfare's chaos prevents perfect execution regardless of planning quality. Fletcher orders his task force to withdraw southeast after the exchange, declining to pursue Japanese carriers into darkness and accepting a tactical draw rather than risking night engagement that American forces lack training to execute effectively. The strategic results of Eastern Solomons emerge over the following days, as Japanese forces abandon their attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal by surface convoy, the troop transports turning back rather than continuing toward an island where American carriers threaten their destruction. And Fletcher's task force succeeded in its primary mission, protecting Guadalcanal from Japanese reinforcement, while also sinking one enemy carrier and damaging numerous Japanese aircraft without losing any American carriers. The exchange ratio favors America clearly. Ryujo sunk, and approximately 90 Japanese aircraft destroyed against Enterprise damaged, and approximately 20 American aircraft lost. The victory lacks the decisive quality of Midway, where 4 Japanese carriers burned in a single morning, but Eastern Solomons accomplishes its objectives at acceptable cost, using tactical methods that balance aggression against preservation more successfully than Fletcher's earlier battles achieved. The political aftermath of Eastern Solomons fails to provide Fletcher with the redemption his performance deserves, made the battle overshadowed by continuing controversy over his Guadalcanal withdrawal, and by an incident that will end his carrier command career. On August 31st, 1 week after Eastern Solomons, Japanese submarine, the Fine 26, penetrates Saratoga's destroyer screen and launches torpedoes that hit the carrier on her starboard side. The torpedo damage proves relatively minor by carrier warfare standards, flooding limited to a few compartments and speed reduced, but the ship remaining operational. Fletcher suffers minor shrapnel wounds during the attack, superficial injuries that require medical treatment, but pose no serious threat to his health or capability. The wounds provide Admiral Ernest King with the justification he has sought for months to relieve Fletcher of carrier command, removing him from tactical operations under cover of medical necessity rather than acknowledging the political decision to replace methodical competence with aggressive boldness. Fletcher's evacuation for medical treatment occurs on September 1st, 1942, ending his carrier command career not with obvious failure or catastrophic defeat, but with minor wounds that barely justify medical evacuation. The timing and circumstances suggest that King seized an opportunity to relieve Fletcher while maintaining plausible justification, the shrapnel wounds providing cover for a decision driven by philosophical disagreement about carrier employment rather than actual combat performance. Fletcher understands the political reality behind his evacuation, writing in private correspondence that his relief was predetermined and that the submarine attack merely provided convenient timing. The letter reveals Fletcher's recognition that his operational philosophy never aligned with King's preference for aggressive action that his carrier command career ended because he prioritized preservation over bold gestures, regardless of how many battles he won, using careful methods that institutional culture could not appreciate. The final assessment of Fletcher's carrier warfare record must account for statistical reality that his critics consistently ignore or minimize. He commanded American carrier forces for 10 months, from late December 1941 through early September 1942. That's the most critical period of the Pacific War, when American carrier strength numbered only 3 or 4 operational ships against Japanese forces that began with 6 fleet carriers. During those 10 months, Fletcher fought 4 major carrier engagements. Coral Sea, where he stopped Japanese expansion toward Australia while losing Lexington. Midway, where he destroyed 4 Japanese carriers while losing Yorktown. Eastern Solomons, where he protected Guadalcanal while damaging Enterprise. And numerous smaller operations where he raided Japanese positions without losing carriers. His final record shows 6 Japanese carriers sunk or crippled: Shoho and Shokaku at Coral Sea, Akagi and Keiga, and Soryu at Midway, Ryujo at Eastern Solomons, against 2 American carriers lost, Lexington and Yorktown. The mathematics of this exchange demonstrate effectiveness that few commanders in any navy achieved, yet Fletcher receives relief rather than recognition for results that speak clearly, despite being dismissed by critics who measure success by criteria other than actual outcomes. The human dimension of Fletcher's final carrier battle emerges in accounts from pilots and staff officers who describe their admiral during the Eastern Solomons engagement. They report Fletcher calm and methodical throughout the battle, making decisions based on available information without apparent anxiety or second-guessing, maintaining professional demeanor during the chaos when Japanese strikes hit Enterprise and American strikes reported Ryujo sinking. The descriptions match earlier accounts of Fletcher in combat: competent, thorough, unflappable, but never inspiring in the way that charismatic commanders generate emotional loyalty from subordinates. His staff respects his tactical competence without forming the personal bonds that create political networks defending commanders against criticism. The relationships Fletcher maintains remain professional rather than personal, effective for operational purposes, but inadequate for building the political support that might protect him from King's determination to install aggressive commanders, regardless of Fletcher's actual combat effectiveness. The strategic irony of Fletcher's relief becomes apparent in subsequent months, as the commanders replacing him lose carriers at rates that vindicate his cautious approach to force preservation. Admiral William Halsey, assuming South Pacific Command in October, loses carrier Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz through aggressive tactics that achieve tactical objectives while accepting casualties Fletcher would have considered unacceptable. Additional carriers fall to Japanese submarines and air attacks during operations where aggressive employment overrides preservation concerns. American losses in the 6 months following Fletcher's relief, exceeding losses during the 10 months of his command. The pattern suggests that Fletcher's caution reflected accurate assessment of carrier vulnerability rather than excessive timidity, that his fuel calculations and risk assessments proved more realistic than critics' preference for bold action. But vindication comes too late to save his carrier command career. The institutional Navy, having decided that Fletcher's methods don't match the aggressive warfare America must wage, regardless of whether his careful approach actually produces better results than the boldness that replaces him. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher returns to Pearl Harbor on September 15, 1942, aboard a hospital ship carrying wounded from the Guadalcanal campaign, his own minor shrapnel injuries having healed during the voyage. but his career as a carrier commander effectively ended by decisions made in Washington before he departed the South Pacific. He expects to resume carrier command after medical clearance, understanding that his wounds were superficial and that Saratoga remains operational despite the torpedo damage that accompanied his wounding. The expectation proves naive as Fletcher discovers in an uncomfortable meeting with Admiral Chester Nimitz on September 20th, when the Pacific Fleet commander explains that Admiral Ernest King has decided carrier forces in the South Pacific require new leadership, that Fletcher's relief reflects strategic considerations rather than medical necessity, that the official explanation will cite health concerns to avoid public controversy over command changes during active operations. Nimitz's explanation combines genuine regret with institutional necessity as he informs Fletcher of the decision that both men understand originates from King rather than from Nimitz's assessment of Fletcher's performance. Nimitz acknowledges Fletcher's tactical competence and operational success, noting that Fletcher accomplished every assigned mission while commanding carriers during the war's most critical phase. The praise rings hollow when followed by notification that Fletcher will not return to carrier command, that younger officers will assume responsibility for offensive operations in the South Pacific, that Fletcher's new assignment will utilize his administrative skills rather than his combat experience. Nimitz cannot or will not specify what assignment awaits Fletcher, the awkward silence revealing that no one has planned what to do with an admiral whose combat record justifies promotion, but whose operational philosophy makes him unsuitable for continued tactical command, according to Washington's assessment. The formal announcement on October 1st declares command changes that reshape the South Pacific theater while minimizing Fletcher's relief through timing and presentation. Admiral William Halsey replaces Vice Admiral Robert Gormley as Commander South Pacific, a change that dominates press coverage and deflects attention from subordinate reassignments. Fletcher appears in announcements as being reassigned to administrative duties after meritorious service commanding carrier forces, language that could describe either honor or exile, depending on interpretation. The bureaucratic prose obscures the reality that Fletcher has been removed from combat command at age 57, despite an operational record that exceeds most admirals' careers, and that his relief reflects King's philosophical preference for aggressive commanders rather than any failure Fletcher committed, that his carrier warfare career ends with statistical success but political defeat. The Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26th provides bitter vindication of Fletcher's cautious approach to carrier operations, as Admiral Halsey's aggressive tactics produce exactly the kind of costly exchange Fletcher spent months trying to avoid. Halsey commits carriers Enterprise and Hornet to supporting Guadalcanal operations with the aggressive spirit King demanded, accepting risks that Fletcher considered unacceptable in pursuit of tactical objectives. Japanese carrier forces counterattack with strikes that sink Hornet and badly damage Enterprise, reducing American carrier strength in the South Pacific to 0 operational carriers. The Japanese carriers suffer damage but survive, escaping to fight again while Halsey's force limps back to base, having lost 1 fleet carrier and had another put out of action for months. The exchange demonstrates that aggressive carrier employment against competent opponents produces mutual destruction rather than decisive victory, that Fletcher's preservation philosophy reflected tactical wisdom rather than excessive caution, that the Navy is learning, through painful experience, the lessons Fletcher tried to teach, through careful operations that preserve forces for sustained campaigns. The statistical comparison between Fletcher's carrier command record and the results achieved by commanders replacing him should vindicate his operational approach, but instead disappears into classified reports that few officers examine objectively. Fletcher lost 2 carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, during 10 months commanding carrier forces in 4 major battles, plus numerous smaller operations. His replacements lost Hornet within months of assuming command, suffered additional carrier damage that reduced operational availability, and achieved tactical results roughly comparable to Fletcher's outcomes, despite accessing superior resources, as American industrial production began reaching the fleet. The comparison suggests Fletcher's methods produced equivalent or better results than the aggressive tactics that replaced them. But institutional Navy never conducts the analysis that might challenge King's decision to relieve Fletcher or question whether boldness actually serves American strategic interests better than careful force management. Fletcher's assignment to command the 13th Naval District, headquartered in Seattle, represents exile to a backwater far from combat operations, where real careers advance and reputations get made. The 13th Naval District encompasses the Pacific Northwest, responsible for training facilities, naval stations, and administrative functions that support combat forces operating thousands of miles away in the South Pacific. The assignment utilizes Fletcher's organizational competence while removing him from any role where his cautious approach might influence tactical operations. He arrives in Seattle in November 1942, assuming command of facilities training pilots who will fly combat missions under other admirals, managing logistics that support fleets he no longer commands, performing important work that lacks the significance or visibility of combat command. The exile proves comfortable by military standards. Fletcher lives in Seattle rather than aboard ship, faces no immediate danger, supervises competent staffs executing routine functions. But the assignment makes clear that his career has reached its ceiling, despite being a rear admiral with a combat record few officers match. The Navy's promotion of younger, more aggressive officers to replace Fletcher and other cautious commanders reveals institutional preference for boldness over effectiveness that will shape American naval operations for the remainder of the war. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded as Fletcher's subordinate at Midway, receives promotion to command major operations in the Central Pacific, despite his actual combat record consisting entirely of actions taken while under Fletcher's overall command. Admiral Mark Mitcher, an aggressive aviator who never commanded during the war's first critical year, assumes Carrier Task Force command and becomes celebrated for bold strikes that produce headlines. The pattern demonstrates that institutional Navy values aggressive action and quotable boldness more highly than the methodical competence that Fletcher demonstrated. That's that perception and personality matter more than statistical results in determining which officers receive critical assignments and historical recognition. King's justification for Fletcher's relief, communicated through channels to explain the decision to senior officers who might question removing a successful combat commander, emphasizes the need for aggressive leadership during offensive operations, rather than acknowledging philosophical disagreement or political motivation. King argues that Fletcher's caution suited defensive operations when America possessed minimal carrier strength, but that offensive warfare requires commanders willing to accept higher risks for greater results. The explanation sounds plausible until compared against actual outcomes. Fletcher's defensive operations at Coral Sea stopped Japanese expansion. His cautious positioning at Midway destroyed 4 carriers. His timid withdrawal from Guadalcanal preserved carriers for future battles, including Eastern Solomons. King's characterization reflects institutional bias rather than objective analysis, describing Fletcher's methods in terms that justify replacement, while ignoring that those methods actually produced superior results to the aggressive tactics King prefers. Fletcher's response to his relief demonstrates the dignity and professionalism that characterized his entire career, while also guaranteeing his historical obscurity. He accepts reassignment without public complaint, makes no statements to press criticizing the decision or defending his record, writes no letters to political figures seeking intervention or reconsideration. And his private correspondence shows disappointment but not bitterness, recognition that institutional politics determined his fate more than tactical performance, acceptance that fighting decisions already made would accomplish nothing beyond damaging his reputation further. The silence that Fletcher maintains protects his professional standing in the short term, but ensures that his version of events never enters historical record, that critics' characterizations face no rebuttal, that mythology replaces reality in shaping how subsequent generations understand the Pacific War's first critical year. Fletcher's refusal to defend himself reflects either admirable restraint or tragic passivity, dignity, that costs him recognition that self-promotion might have secured. Nimitz's private assessment of Fletcher's relief and recorded in correspondence with other senior officers, reveals the Pacific Fleet commander's genuine respect for Fletcher's tactical competence combined with acceptance that King's decision cannot be reversed. Nimitz writes that Fletcher understood carrier warfare better than his critics, that his fuel calculations and risk assessments proved accurate, that his preservation of carrier strength during the war's most desperate phase enabled subsequent American offensives. But Nimitz also acknowledges that Fletcher's quiet personality and cautious operational style created perception problems that political leadership found unacceptable, that war requires commanders who inspire confidence in addition to producing results, that Fletcher's effectiveness couldn't overcome his inability or unwillingness to cultivate the support networks that protect senior officers from criticism. The assessment damns Fletcher with honest evaluation, acknowledging his competence while explaining why competence proved insufficient for continued combat command in a military institution that values perception alongside performance. The long-term consequence of Fletcher's relief extends beyond his personal career to shape how the Navy develops doctrine and selects commanders for critical assignments throughout the remainder of the war. Junior officers learn that caution brings relief, regardless of results achieved, that aggressive action earns promotion even when producing costly outcomes, that institutional culture rewards bold decisions more reliably than careful calculation. The lesson influences operational planning, as commanders calculate that proposing aggressive actions carries less career risk than recommending careful approaches regardless of which strategy better serves tactical situations. Fletcher's relief teaches the wrong lessons to officers who should learn from his actual results, rather than from the political circumstances that ended his combat command, ensuring that institutional Navy will repeat mistakes that Fletcher's methods might have prevented if his approach had been studied, rather than dismissed as excessive caution, unsuitable for offensive warfare. The headquarters of the 13th Naval District occupies office buildings in Seattle, far from the South Pacific waters, where Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher won the carrier battles that broke Japanese naval power but failed to secure his reputation. Fletcher settles into his new command in late 1942, supervising training facilities and administrative functions that support combat operations he no longer directs. The work proves important if unglamorous, training pilots who will fight at Tarawa and the Philippine Sea, managing logistics for ships deploying to forward areas, coordinating with civilian industry, producing the weapons and equipment that American forces require. Fletcher brings to administrative work the same methodical competence he demonstrated in combat command, all organizing systems efficiently and solving problems through careful analysis rather than dramatic gestures. The skills that made him an effective carrier commander translate adequately to staff work, but the assignment represents professional exile regardless of how well Fletcher performs duties that keep him thousands of miles from combat that matters. The contrast between Fletcher's exile and the combat careers of younger officers he trained or influenced becomes stark as the war progresses through 1943 and 44. Admiral Raymond Spruance commands the Central Pacific Offensive, winning decisive victories at the Philippine Sea using tactical doctrine that Fletcher helped develop at Coral Sea and Midway. Admiral Mark Mitcher leads fast carrier task forces in strikes across the Pacific, and employing carrier coordination techniques that Fletcher pioneered during the war's first critical year. The officers Fletcher commanded, pilots from Yorktown and Lexington, staff officers who learned carrier operations under his command, win battles and earn recognition, while Fletcher manages training facilities in Seattle. The pattern reveals how military institutions work, younger officers building on foundations that senior commanders establish, but receiving recognition while founders fade into obscurity. Combat success erasing memory of the careful groundwork that made later victories possible. Fletcher's promotion to full admiral in September 1944 appears to recognize his service, but actually represents the Navy's standard practice of promoting officers to higher rank when assigning them to positions requiring that rank rather than awarding recognition for combat achievement. The 4 stars Fletcher receives come with assignment to administrative duties requiring admiral rank, his promotion coinciding with job requirements rather than celebrating his tactical accomplishments. The timing makes the promotion feel hollow, Fletcher receives his 4th star, while contemporaries like Halsey and Spruance command fleets in combat, while junior officers who never fought during the war's first desperate year earn fame through battles made possible by carrier strength Fletcher preserved. The promotion demonstrates that institutional Navy distinguishes between administrative rank and combat recognition, that Fletcher can receive the former while being denied the latter, that 4 stars on his shoulder don't erase the reputation damage from being relieved of carrier command, despite his operational success. The tactical doctrine Fletcher developed through trial and error during the war's first year becomes standard practice taught to new carrier commanders without attribution to Fletcher's pioneering work. The Naval War College curriculum includes lessons on carrier task force coordination, fuel management, and risk assessment that directly reflect Fletcher's methods at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons. The training documents emphasize preserving carrier strength for sustained operations, rather than risking everything for immediate tactical success, doctrine that mirrors Fletcher's operational philosophy. The damage control procedures that saved Yorktown at Coral Sea and kept Enterprise fighting at Eastern Solomons become required training for all carrier crews. Fighter direction techniques that Fletcher's task forces developed inform how later's carrier groups defend against Japanese air attacks. The contributions remain invisible because institutional Navy adopts successful methods without tracking their origins. Fletcher's innovations becoming anonymous doctrine rather than recognized achievements associated with his name. The news from the Pacific reaches Seattle in delayed summaries that allow Fletcher to follow the war's progress while remaining disconnected from operations he helped make possible. He reads about the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where Spruance's carrier forces destroyed Japanese naval aviation in what becomes known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the decisive victory achieved using tactics Fletcher employed at Midway 2 years earlier. He learns of kamikaze attacks at Okinawa in spring 1945, the suicide tactics that validate Fletcher's warnings about operating carriers within range of land-based air power. The reports arrive weeks after events occur, filtered through official summaries that remove the immediacy and personal stakes Fletcher knew when commanding in combat, all reducing his role to distant observer of a war he fought during its most critical phase, but now watches from administrative exile. Fletcher's assignment to the North Pacific Force in 1944 represents another staff position removed from combat that matters. Commanding forces in the Aleutians, where Japanese presence has been eliminated, and active operations consist primarily of patrol and training. The assignment recognizes Fletcher's rank while keeping him away from the Central Pacific, where carrier battles determine the war's outcome. He commands competently, managing forces executing routine missions in a quiet theater. But the work lacks significance compared to the offensive operations pushing toward Japan. The North Pacific assignment continues the pattern established in Seattle, important work performed professionally, but divorced from combat that creates reputations and shapes historical memory. Fletcher spends the war's final year managing a backwater theater, while officers he trained or influenced win the battles that bring Japan to surrender. The personal impact of exile emerges in Fletcher's sparse correspondence, letters to family and Naval Academy classmates that reveal a man at peace with his circumstances, while understanding how institutional politics determined his fate. He writes that he served as best he could, that results speak for themselves regardless of reputation, that history will judge his record more fairly than contemporary critics whose assessments reflect institutional bias rather than objective analysis. The letters show no bitterness about his relief or exile, Fletcher accepting that he operated in a military culture that valued qualities he didn't possess, that his tactical competence couldn't overcome his inability to cultivate political support, networks, or project the aggressive personality that institutional Navy preferred. The philosophical acceptance reflects either mature wisdom or resigned defeat depending on interpretation. Fletcher moving forward without dwelling on injustices he cannot correct or recognition he will never receive. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 end the Pacific War, while Fletcher commands forces in Alaska, thousands of miles from the ceremonies and celebrations that marked Japan's surrender. He receives news of VJ Day through official channels, learning of Japan's capitulation while managing administrative duties in a quiet theater. His role in creating conditions for victory completely disconnected from his presence during the surrender celebrations. The iconic photograph of Admiral Nimitz signing surrender documents aboard battleship Missouri includes officers who commanded during the war's final year, but not Fletcher, whose carrier battles in the first year made those final victories possible. The image captures how history remembers, present commanders receiving recognition, while those who fought during desperate times fade from official photographs and public memory. Fletcher's post-war assignments continue the pattern of important but unglamorous staff positions that utilize his organizational competence while keeping him removed from high-visibility roles that create lasting reputations. He serves as chairman of the General Board, a policy advisory body that shapes future naval development, contributing to planning that will guide the post-war Navy through demobilization and Cold War reorientation. The work proves significant for institutional Navy while generating no public recognition or historical legacy beyond bureaucratic documents that specialists might consult decades later. Fletcher retires in May 1947 after 41 years of service. His departure marked by standard ceremonies and official letters of appreciation that acknowledge his career without highlighting the combat achievements that should have defined his legacy. The silence Fletcher maintains about his relief and his combat record becomes absolute during retirement, as he declines interview requests, refuses to write memoirs that might correct historical misconceptions, avoids public appearances where he might discuss the battles that made him the most successful American carrier commander of the war's first critical year. The refusal to defend himself or correct the record reflects Fletcher's consistent approach to reputation and legacy. Let results speak for themselves, avoid self-promotion. They maintain dignity through silence rather than engaging in public debate about decisions made years earlier, under circumstances critics never experienced. The silence guarantees Fletcher's obscurity as other admirals publish memoirs that shape public understanding, as historians rely on available sources rather than seeking out officers who refuse to participate in historical debate. As mythology replaces documentary evidence in creating narratives that exclude inconvenient figures whose actual records contradict preferred stories about bold warriors winning through aggressive action. The publication of Admiral William Halsey's memoir in 1947 initiates the post-war narrative construction that will shape how Americans remember the Pacific War and which admirals receive credit for victory. Halsey's book becomes a bestseller, his aggressive personality and quotable prose creating compelling narrative of bold warriors defeating timid enemies through sheer fighting spirit. The memoir mentions Fletcher rarely and never by name, but Halsey's descriptions of unnamed, overly cautious commanders who needed aggressive subordinates to achieve results clearly reference Fletcher and other methodical officers whom Halsey considered insufficiently bold. The characterizations stick because Halsey provides the only insider account most readers will encounter, his version of events becoming accepted truth through repetition and absence of contrary narratives from officers like Fletcher who refuse to publish their own accounts or challenge Halsey's mythology. The official naval history written by Samuel Eliot Morison between 1947 and 1962 establishes academic legitimacy for narratives that favor aggressive commanders over methodical planners like Fletcher. Morison's multi-volume history becomes the definitive scholarly account of the Pacific War, his access to official documents and interview subjects giving his interpretations authority that subsequent historians struggle to challenge. Morison's treatment of Fletcher relies heavily on Admiral Ernest King's wartime assessments, repeating King's criticisms about Fletcher being too cautious at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal, without examining battle records or questioning whether King's judgments reflected institutional bias rather than objective analysis. The history acknowledges Fletcher's role at Midway, but attributes success primarily to Spruance's aggressive action and pilot courage, rather than to Fletcher's positioning and tactical command. Morison's academic credentials give his assessments credibility that shapes how universities teach Pacific War history for decades. Fletcher appearing in these accounts as competent but uninspiring successful through circumstance rather than skill. The popular media representations of the Pacific War during the 1950s cement Fletcher's obscurity through visual narratives that feature dramatic personalities, while ignoring quiet professionals whose actual records deserve recognition. The television documentary series Victory at Sea in 1952 and 53 presents the Pacific War as a story of bold American warriors overcoming Japanese aggression through courage and fighting spirit, featuring Halsey prominently while never mentioning Fletcher. The series shapes public memory for millions of viewers who encounter Pacific War history primarily through television rather than scholarly books, creating visual mythology that has no room for cautious admirals or complex tactical decisions. Fletcher's absence from Victory at Sea reflects not just editorial choices, but institutional Navy's complicity in promoting narratives that favor aggressive personalities over effective management. The service providing footage and cooperation for documentaries that reinforce preferred stories about how America won the war. Fletcher's rare public statement about his combat record comes in a 1969 interview with the United States Naval Institute, a brief conversation that receives minimal distribution and gets buried in archives rather than shaping public understanding. Fletcher tells the interviewer that he commanded as he thought best given the circumstances, that carrier preservation mattered more during the war's first year than aggressive action for its own sake, that his decisions reflected tactical reality rather than personal timidity. The interview shows Fletcher defending his record with statistical evidence. 6 Japanese carriers sunk or damaged against 2 American carriers lost. Both strategic objectives achieved at all 4 major battles. Tactical competence demonstrated consistently, even when results proved imperfect. But the interview reaches only specialist audiences, appearing in a professional journal rather than popular magazines, generating no media coverage that might challenge established narratives about cautious Fletcher, and aggressive spruance winning through opposite approaches to identical problems. The disconnect between Fletcher's actual combat record and his historical reputation becomes most apparent when comparing statistical outcomes against narrative characterizations. Fletcher commanded American carriers for 10 months, encompassing 4 major battles, plus numerous smaller operations, losing 2 carriers while sinking 6 Japanese carriers and stopping every Japanese offensive he opposed. The commanders replacing Fletcher lost carriers at similar or higher rates, while achieving tactical results roughly comparable to Fletcher's outcomes, despite accessing superior resources as American production reached the Pacific Fleet. The statistical comparison suggests Fletcher's methods produced equivalent or better results than aggressive tactics that replaced them, but the statistics never penetrate public consciousness because popular history focuses on personalities rather than data, on compelling stories rather than uncomfortable evidence that contradicts preferred narratives. The generational shift among naval officers during the 1950s and 60s ensures that Fletcher's combat experience and tactical innovations fade from institutional memory as veterans retire, and younger officers learn Pacific War history from sources that minimize Fletcher's contributions. The Naval War College teaches Midway as a case study emphasizing Spruance's aggressive launch decision and dive bomber attacks rather than Fletcher's positioning and overall tactical command. Officer training emphasizes bold action and offensive spirit as essential qualities for command, rather than the careful calculation and risk assessment that Fletcher demonstrated. The new generation learns mythology rather than history, absorbing lessons about aggressive warfare, producing victory without understanding the complex reality where Fletcher's caution actually preserved forces that made sustained offensive operations possible once American industrial production reached the combat zone. Fletcher's death in 1973 receives minimal media coverage, obituaries noting his service during World War II, without emphasizing his combat achievements, or questioning why an admiral who won more carrier battles than anyone else in history remains virtually unknown to the American public. The New York Times obituary runs 6 paragraphs describing Fletcher's career in general terms, mentioning Coral Sea and Midway, but focusing more on his post-war service than on the battles that broke Japanese naval power. The The Washington Post obituary characterizes Fletcher as competent but cautious, repeating the standard assessment without examining whether caution during a period when America possessed only 3 or 4 carriers reflected wisdom rather than timidity. The brief obituaries ensure that Fletcher's death passes without prompting reassessment of his combat record or challenging the narratives that relegated him to historical obscurity, despite achievements that should have made him among the war's most celebrated commanders. The academic re-examination of Fletcher's combat record begins slowly in the 1990s, as historians gain access to Japanese sources and declassified American documents that allow more complete analysis of the Pacific War's first year. John Lundstrom's scholarship on Coral Sea and Midway challenges standard narratives, demonstrating through careful documentation that Fletcher's tactical decisions made more sense than critics acknowledged, that his fuel calculations proved accurate, that his positioning at Midway created conditions for the decisive victory that mythology attributes primarily to Spruance and the pilots. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully's analysis of Midway from Japanese perspective shows how Fletcher's careful search procedures and Spruance's coordination produced the timing that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes, vindicating Fletcher's methodical approach, even though popular history ignores these scholarly corrections. The persistence of false narratives about Fletcher, despite academic reassessment, demonstrates how public memory resists correction. Once myths become established through repetition and cultural reinforcement. Documentary films produced in the 21st century continue repeating the cautious Fletcher characterization, relying on secondary sources rather than examining primary documents or engaging with scholarship that challenges conventional wisdom. Popular books about Midway feature Spruance as the hero while relegating Fletcher to supporting role despite documentary evidence that Fletcher commanded the battle and Spruance operated as his subordinate. The mythology proves remarkably resistant to factual correction, all audiences preferring familiar stories about bold warriors to complex reality where careful planning and methodical execution produced victories that aggressive gambling might have prevented. The cultural preference for aggressive narratives over complex reality explains Fletcher's continuing obscurity, while less accomplished but more quotable admirals remain celebrated in popular memory. Halsey's declaration that he would run wild in the Pacific creates memorable sound bites that documentary makers can feature, while Fletcher's careful fuel calculations and tactical positioning don't translate into dramatic television moments. Spruance's Midway command provides visual opportunities showing aggressive action, while Fletcher's role positioning forces and coordinating searches lack cinematic appeal. Yet the mythology serves cultural needs for simple stories about bold heroes winning through fighting spirit, narratives that leave no room for admirals who won through mathematical precision and careful risk management rather than through personally inspiring aggressive warfare. Fletcher's exclusion from popular memory reflects not his failure, but history's preference for satisfying stories over accurate but complicated truth about how complex operations actually succeed. The Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, conducts a computer-simulated war game of the Battle of Midway in 2018, using modern analysis tools to examine whether Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's tactical decisions reflected optimal command choices or whether critics' complaints about excessive caution had merit. The simulation runs multiple iterations, varying timing, positioning, and attack decisions while holding constant the intelligence advantages and force composition that shaped the historical battle. The results vindicate Fletcher comprehensively. His positioning northeast of Midway proves optimal for achieving surprise while maintaining sea room for maneuvering. His search procedures provide target information at exactly the right timing for coordinated strikes. His coordination with Admiral Raymond Spruance's task group produces the simultaneous attacks that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers in minutes. The simulation demonstrates that more aggressive positioning would have exposed American carriers to earlier detection, that launching strikes without careful target verification risked missing Japanese carriers entirely. That Fletcher's cautious decisions actually reflected tactical sophistication that aggressive alternatives would have compromised. The human cost of Fletcher's historical obscurity emerges in conversations with his grandson during interviews for naval history projects that finally attempt to understand why the admiral who won the most important carrier battles remains virtually unknown. The grandson describes a man who never discussed the war with family, who declined interview requests throughout retirement, who watched documentaries featuring other admirals without commenting on inaccuracies or defending his own record. Fletcher apparently told his family that he had done his duty to the best of his ability, that results spoke for themselves regardless of reputation, that engaging in public debate about events from decades past served no useful purpose. The grandson interprets his grandfather's silence as dignity and professional restraint, but acknowledges that the refusal to defend himself or correct false narratives guaranteed obscurity that self-promotion might have prevented. The family possesses no personal papers beyond official documents, Fletcher apparently having destroyed private correspondence rather than preserving materials that might support future biographical work or historical reassessment. The statistical comparison between Fletcher's carrier command record and the performance of admirals who replaced him reveals the extent to which institutional Navy learned the wrong lessons from relieving him in favor of more aggressive commanders. Yet Fletcher lost 2 carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, during 10 months commanding carrier operations in 4 major battles, achieving strategic objectives while maintaining overall force preservation. The 6 months following Fletcher's relief saw Hornet sunk at Santa Cruz under Halsey's aggressive command, multiple carriers damaged in operations where boldness overrode preservation concerns, and tactical results roughly equivalent to what Fletcher achieved despite accessing superior resources as American production reached combat zones. The carrier loss rate actually increased after Fletcher's relief, suggesting his cautious approach better protected irreplaceable assets than the aggressive tactics King demanded and that Fletcher's successors employed. The doctrinal legacy Fletcher left, despite receiving minimal credit, becomes apparent when examining modern carrier warfare doctrine that incorporates principles Fletcher pioneered through trial and error during the Pacific War's first year. Contemporary carrier task force operations emphasize fuel management and logistics planning that Fletcher made central to his tactical approach, acknowledging what he understood instinctively, that carriers without fuel are targets rather than weapons. Modern doctrine stresses force preservation and sustainability over seeking decisive engagement regardless of risk, accepting Fletcher's philosophy that maintaining capability for sustained operations serves strategic interests better than gambling everything for immediate tactical success. The damage control procedures and fighter direction techniques that Fletcher's forces developed remain foundational to how modern carriers defend themselves and manage battle damage. The tactical innovations Fletcher contributed became anonymous doctrine rather than recognized achievements, his methods absorbed into standard practice without attribution to the admiral who pioneered them under desperate circumstances when failure would have lost the Pacific War. The broader question of how military institutions evaluate commanders and construct historical narratives extends beyond Fletcher's individual case to encompass how organizations remember success and failure. Fletcher demonstrated that effective leadership in crisis may look different than heroic mythology suggests, and that mathematical precision and careful risk assessment produce better results than bold gestures and aggressive gambling when resources cannot be replaced and mistakes prove catastrophic. But military institutions prefer narratives about warriors conquering through fighting spirit, stories that inspire recruits and justify continued military investment more effectively than accounts of careful managers preserving forces through methodical competence. Fletcher's obscurity serves institutional interests even while representing historical injustice, his exclusion from popular memory allowing the Navy to promote mythology about aggressive warfare producing victory, without acknowledging that preservation often matters more than offense when forces are scarce and stakes are total. The counterfactual analysis that historians conduct about alternative outcomes, had Fletcher been relieved earlier or retained longer, reveals how critical his command was during the period when American carrier strength barely exceeded what Japan could concentrate for major battles. Had Fletcher been relieved after Coral Sea as King apparently wanted, the Midway command would have fallen to less experienced admirals who lacked Fletcher's understanding of carrier operations and fuel logistics, potentially producing disaster rather than decisive victory if American carriers had been positioned less optimally or if coordination between task groups had failed. Had Fletcher remained in command through the Guadalcanal campaign and beyond, then American carrier losses might have been reduced as his cautious approach prevented the kind of aggressive operations that cost Hornet at Santa Cruz and damaged other carriers in subsequent battles. The counterfactual exercises demonstrate that Fletcher's actual command tenure, 10 months encompassing the war's most critical carrier battles, represented optimal timing despite being cut short by political factors rather than performance considerations. The modern reassessment of Fletcher's record by naval historians with access to both American and Japanese sources demonstrates that his tactical decisions made sense given the information available and objectives assigned, that his fuel calculations proved accurate rather than excessive, that his preservation focus reflected strategic wisdom rather than personal timidity. At Coral Sea stopped Japanese expansion at acceptable cost, when losing both American carriers would have been catastrophic. Midway achieved decisive victory through positioning and timing that Fletcher's careful planning enabled. Eastern Solomons protected Guadalcanal while maintaining carrier strength for future operations. The record shows consistent tactical competence producing strategic results that served American interests even when outcomes deviated from perfect victory. But academic reassessment reaches specialist audiences rather than shaping popular understanding, Fletcher's rehabilitation in scholarly literature having minimal impact on broader cultural memory that continues preferring mythology about bold warriors to complex reality about effective management. The final assessment of Fletcher's significance must account for both his tactical achievements and his historical obscurity, understanding that he won the battles that mattered most while losing the reputation war that determines who gets remembered. Frank Jack Fletcher commanded more carrier battles than any American admiral in World War II. Winning engagements when losing would have cost the Pacific War, preserving forces that made subsequent victories possible, demonstrating tactical competence that few commanders in any navy have matched. His relief from carrier command reflected institutional politics and philosophical disagreement about carrier employment rather than combat failure, King's preference for aggressive warfare overriding Fletcher's proven effectiveness at balancing preservation with offensive action. Fletcher's silence about his mistreatment guaranteed his obscurity, his refusal to defend himself or write memoirs, allowing mythology to replace reality, in shaping how subsequent generations understand the Pacific War's first critical year. The lessons Fletcher's career teaches extend beyond his individual case to inform how institutions select leaders and evaluate performance during crisis. Effective leadership in desperate circumstances may emphasize preservation over bold gestures when resources are scarce and losses irreplaceable, yet institutional culture often values appearance over substance, preferring commanders who project warrior ethos regardless of actual results. Fletcher's statistical record: 6 Japanese carriers sunk against 2 American carriers lost. Strategic objectives achieved consistently. All tactical competence demonstrated across multiple battles should vindicate his methods comprehensively, but reputation depends on perception rather than data, on political skill rather than operational effectiveness. The military culture that relieved Fletcher, despite his success, teaches that boldness matters more than results, that aggressive action earns promotion, while careful calculation brings career death regardless of outcomes achieved. The contemporary relevance of Fletcher's story emerges when considering how modern military and civilian organizations evaluate leaders during crisis, whether they reward effective management or prefer bold personalities, whether they measure success by outcomes or by how leaders appear while achieving those outcomes. Fletcher's career demonstrates that organizations often get this calculation wrong. They are promoting commanders whose personalities match institutional preferences rather than those whose methods produce best results, constructing mythologies that serve organizational interests rather than historical truth. The admiral history forgot deserves remembrance not just for his tactical achievements, but for what his obscurity reveals about how institutions remember, how they reward, and how they teach lessons to subsequent generations who must lead during their own crises without understanding what actually worked, when everything hung in the balance and careful competence mattered more than aggressive mythology. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher won the Pacific War's most critical carrier battles, Coral Sea, Midway, and Eastern Solomons, during the desperate months when American carrier strength could be counted on one hand. He sank 6 Japanese carriers while losing 2, stopped Japanese expansion, and preserved American forces for the offensive operations that would follow. Yet, he remains virtually unknown while subordinate commanders became legends. His story matters not because he deserves personal recognition, though he does, but because his obscurity reveals how organizations construct mythology rather than honor truth, how perception matters more than performance, how careful competence loses to bold incompetence when institutions value narratives over results. Fletcher's silence, his refusal to defend himself or correct the record, demonstrated either profound dignity or tragic passivity. He took his story to the grave, believing results would speak for themselves. They did not. The results got buried beneath mythology about aggressive warriors winning through fighting spirit, comfortable stories that left no room for admirals who won through mathematical precision and careful planning rather than quotable boldness. This documentary exists because Fletcher's actual record finally demands recognition, because the statistical evidence overwhelms the mythology, because understanding how America actually won the Pacific War requires acknowledging the admiral who fought during the months when losing would have lost everything. Remember Frank Jack Fletcher, not as the cautious admiral that mythology portrays, but as the effective commander who won when winning mattered most, who preserved when preservation enabled victory, who served with dignity and obscurity rather than seeking glory through self-promotion. History forgot him. We remember.